Hey guys, welcome to Fanfic Fanatics. So in today's video we are gonna see, what if neglected Deku fell in love with Hagakure? Part 4. Before starting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you are interested in MHA fanfictions. This story is All the Power by Big Teddy 3498. Now without wasting any more time, let's dive in. Why do you want to scare people? Eri asked, looking up at Izuku. It's part of the fun of a school festival. Every class chooses something different to do, like cooking or making a play. We chose to do a haunted house and the theme was Japanese folklore horror. It's harmless fun, Izuku said, smiling down at her and patted her head. Eri had become close to Izuku as she stayed at UA and learned to control her quirk. It was very rare now if Eri lost control of her quirk and needed Aizawa or Izuku nearby to make sure nothing went wrong. It's been over a month since that happened and Eri has gained good control of it. When she first arrived at UA, she had been nervous and it made sense to Izuku. For so long she had been used as a source and experiment by the worst kind of villains. To suddenly being in a safe environment with people treating her like she should have, it's a big change for her. Before she was skittish and afraid to make anyone upset lest they punish her like back with Overhaul, but now she openly asks questions and isn't afraid of being curious. While she was comfortable with almost everyone in 1A, she was most comfortable with Izuku's gang and Izuku himself. What's Japanese folklore? Eri tilted her head to the side in question. Izuku hummed in the thought of how best to explain. Back before quirks came, people believed that there were supernatural things like spirits or ghosts, and there might have been. People began to name these spirits that multiple people saw. Some were scary and some were nice. Izuku shrugged. There's not much of that anymore with quirks being around, but there are superstitious people. That means people who believe in the supernatural. He finished his explanation and looked down to see if Eri understood some of what he had said. Eri made an O with her mouth and nodded in understanding. Are ghosts and spirits real? She looked around as if she could see one if she looked hard enough. Izuku hummed in thought. I like to think there are some things most people can't see. Seems more fun like that than just people with quirks messing around, he said, smiling. But who knows? The two made their way inside the building they were given for the haunted house and saw Izuku's classmates finishing up the last details of the tunnel and the rooms that people would have to traverse to get to the other tunnel. The small rooms they built had fake trees and bushes that they needed to move around to densely packed fake spiderwebs Yaoyorozu created. The lights were on, so the path didn't seem too bad, but with Izuku's help and the lights off, it would be pitch black. They had that saved for one room where the room was a small maze and they had to find their way through touch. Not even the brightest light would help in that lost section Izuku was in charge of. What do you think? Denki asked from above the two walking the path. He was with some others finishing the lighting for the path before the next day when the festival began. Pretty good, but I've never been in one of these, so. Izuku shrugged. Eri nodded along and shrugged with him. Denki smirked at the two in amusement. We need to get you out more, he said to Izuku. He turned back when someone called his name to help with some wiring and waved at the two as he got back to work. Later, Izuku showed Eri the section he would be in charge of. It was a small maze with traditional Japanese walls. Chains dangled from the ceiling and scattered bones lay on the ground that clattered when they shifted. The bones were made of wood, but the sound they made was perfect, as Mina put it. Hey, you guys. Mina turned from hanging some more chains on the ceiling. Yaoyorozu looked at the chains with some worry. I think that's too many. I'm not sure if the ceiling would hold, and God forbid someone pulled on them. She bit at her nail and looked around for a solution. Mina waved her off and crouched down next to Eri for a hug. She had been giving the little girl as many hugs as she could when she became more comfortable around them. Eri was more than willing to return the physical contact and Mina held onto her as she spoke. What do you think of all this? She asked the little girl. Eri looked around the room while in Mina's embrace. I dunno, seems scary. She looked at the chains and Yaoyorozu, who was making support pillars for the chains hanging off the ceiling. Wanna be part of it? Mina proposed. How? Mina hummed and said. We can dress you up like a spirit that could help lost people get out of our scary path. Or we can have you say scary things while people walk past you in a hidden wall. She began to plan. Say scary things? Like what? How can I be scary? Eri asked with a frown. Mina giggled. Oh, that's easy. Hearing a child's voice while in a scary place will make the scary place go from a 5 to a 10 on the scary scale. She grinned. Izuku smiled at the two as they began to plan where Eri would hide to whisper as passing victims. It was simple to make cutouts throughout the path for Eri to run around and find someone to terrorize. And Izuku had to admit that Mina was right about the idea that having a child's voice in a dark place would make things worse. "Oh, that's just evil now," Kyoka said from behind them as the three who were planning Eri's lines. "Come on. You gotta admit having Eri go around and ask, 'Are you lost too?' to someone passing by is too great a chance to pass up." Mina squealed in excitement at her friend. "Oh no, I totally agree. It's going to be terrifying for anyone who hears her." Kyoka smirked and patted Eri's head in greeting. "How's it going?" "I'm having fun," Eri said with a gleam in her eyes. Izuku was smiling at the child who was close to smiling herself for the first time he had seen her. "What about you? What do you have planned?" Izuku asked Kyoka. She shrugged. "Not much. Working on the sound effects in some rooms and where the best place to put some small speakers." With the preparations just about done, Izuku continued walking around with Eri and showing her what they had built and how it would work. The absorber saw Bakugo with Kirishima as the redhead talked animatedly to the more often than not quite blonde. Ever since he had apologized to Izuku, he had been keeping to himself. The only one who tried to keep the blonde social was Kirishima, but Izuku could see how it was wearing on the upbeat boy. The rest of the class had been keeping their distance from Bakugo and most especially Izuku's ragtag group of friends he had cultivated. It made sense since they knew the full story of what he had done to Izuku. Izuku ignored Bakugo and continued with Eri. The two found Uraraka and Tsuyu in the costumes for the haunted house. They didn't have their makeup on, so their appearance didn't seem as scary as it should be. The two greeted Eri with happy smiles and they showed off their costumes to the excited young girl. Later that night, most of the class was hanging out in the common room, Izuku's gang of friends included. The small group was seated around one of the coffee tables with a board game on it. Eri was on the couch next to Izuku napping as they played. She had lost interest in the game once too many numbers were being tossed out. Denki was sulking to the side of them. He had lost all his game money and now sat with his phone out. He perked up and turned his phone to the side to watch a video. After a few moments, he interrupted the game. "Yo! Check this out, it's some villain posting online." He turned his phone to face the group. The group of friends watched the gentle criminal monologue about hero society and how ungentlemanly it was. It became even more odd as the villain left the bags of money behind and left the bank with secure guards and heroes alike subdued. "Pretty cool, right?" Denki said after the video was done. Kyoka jabbed his side with an earlobe. "You know that's a villain, right?" As Denki grumbled and rubbed his side, Izuku spoke. "Sure, but at least he's harmless by the looks of it. Gimme a link to the video, I want to watch his quirk again." Toru smirked at Izuku as he pulled his phone out and opened the link sent by the electric user. "Of course, you would focus on that." She teased and bumped shoulders with him. Izuku smiled in return. It looked neat. He defended himself in a mumble as he began to watch the video. His videos have been taken down before, but he continues to open new accounts to upload, Denki explained. "To what end? Does he just want to talk while giving the law the runaround?" Hanta asked, leaning back and looking over Izuku's shoulder to watch the video as well. Mina shrugged. "Pretty weird that he left the money behind. That's weirdo behavior right there. He doesn't do it for the money, maybe for attention. Why else would he upload?" Izuku talked to himself as he replayed the video. "Who do you think is behind the camera?" Toru asked, leaning on Izuku's shoulder. "Someone pretty competent if you ask me. There's basically no camera shaking and he's always in frame. Truly a professional." Hanta praised the unknown person for helping the villain. Denki and Mina both snorted in unison at the observation. "Nerd," Kyoka smirked at the black-haired boy. Hanta looked offended at the statement and turned to his leader. "Boss, they are making fun of me," he said in an odd accent. "Let them make fun of you. It's what you do with the information afterward that shows what kind of person are you." Izuku mumbled, not paying full attention to the conversation as he wrote in his notebook that he pulled out of nowhere. He smiled to himself and finished writing with a small flourish. "This is fun. Denki, find another villain," Izuku said, grinning happily. "See? I'm not a nerd." Hanta motioned to Izuku with both hands. "If I'm a nerd, then what's he?" He said it as if he thought he won the conversation. Kyoka snorted and shook her head. That's completely different. Yeah. Izuku is a nerd because he can find how a quirk works and work around it, whether it be helping or fighting against it. You on the other hand know cameras. Nerd. Denki explained with the finishing barb sticking into Hanta. Hanta's lip quivered and he sniffed once before looking away. I thought we were friends. He dabbed his eyes gently with Izuku's sleeve. Izuku rolled his eyes and pulled his sleeve away from Hanta's fake tears with a smile. Mina asked the green-haired boy. So, you profile the guy? She asked eagerly for information. Mina was more than happy to hear gossip to sat her thirst for knowledge of people, but Izuku's ramblings were even better for her fix. Izuku smiled at having a willing audience for his so-called lectures in quirk analytics. I think he can control the flexibility of objects in his line of sight or area of influence, he said with gleaming eyes. He flipped his phone around to continue to lecture with the video as evidence, the board game long forgotten. The next day, the school festival was in full swing with food stalls and other small kiosks serving small amenities to the families and guests at UA. It was a relaxed atmosphere with the shout of a child having fun or a family laughing as they walked down the path with pro heroes at each corner. The only few who weren't relaxed were those in Class 1A's haunted house. Two second-year general education girls clutched each other in terror with tears threatening to ruin the minimal makeup they chose to apply that morning. This was a mistake, one girl sobbed. We need to keep going. The other tried to pull her shaking friend along the dark path. She clutched at the electric lantern they were given at the beginning of the path and swung it around to see, but it barely illuminated anything. The way out is ahead, quickly before you get lost like I did. The two young adults froze at the sound of the voice of a child in the near pitch-black clearing. The sensible girl swung around to find where the voice came from, but she saw nothing as her breathing quickened in fear. The sobbing girl only cried harder as her friend began to drag her even faster in desperation. Never again. She cried but didn't stop from practically carrying her best friend. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. This isn't fun anymore. The sobbing girl apologized to her best friend over and over again. It has to be a fear quirk. I couldn't imagine what the fuck is that. The girl shrieked and pointed at the yellow glowing eyes peeking from the fake bush. The eyes rose higher and higher as the girls screamed and clutched each other. The two began to sprint down the path without a care of what was in the way. They didn't even see the two other girls dressed up as lost spirits as they sprinted past them. They didn't until the lantern failed to light the way forward into the dark that shouldn't have been that dark. The two tentatively reached out to the wall of darkness but pulled back quickly as their hands disappeared. Not even the lantern in the dark helped. The crying girl began to panic as the other looked around in a frenzy. Maybe there's another way. She looked at the fake walls but there was nothing. Don't let go of the wall and each other. The child's voice came again from somewhere. The crying girl clamped her hand around her best friend's hand after hearing the voice. I don't want to be here anymore, she sobbed. Little girl? What is this? The girl with the lantern asked in a stutter. The end of the path, she said simply, and they could hear a smile in the tone of voice. Why is it so dark? No answer. Hello, little girl. Don't let go of each other in the wall. Don't let go of each other in the wall. The crying girl repeated as the two slowly sank into the darkest of darks. The two slowly shuffled through the dark with the occasional sniff and sob from one or both of them. The one so useful lantern was now a weight that they couldn't let go of, hoping that it worked once again. They froze in their shuffling as one of them kicked something and it clattered loudly against the ground. The sound was much too familiar to the horror movies they watched together on the weekends. They didn't let go of each other as they continued to shuffle along the pitch-black path with the occasional bone being kicked accidentally. They heard the chains rattle but they didn't feel around for them as they stayed completely silent. That was until they fell into the light. They looked around frantically and clutched each other as their eyes adjusted to the light. Please don't forget to rate and review on your way out. They snapped their attention to a cheerfully smiling pink girl who was motioning to the exit and small desk with a few papers and pens. Mina watched the two older teens begin to sob into each other as they broke down in relief. With a frozen smile on her face, she brought the walkie-talkie to her face and spoke. I think it was too much. What do you mean? Yayoruzo's voice came through with a questioning tone. Mina held the button to transmit and held it so they could hear the two older teens sobbing loudly. She stopped after a moment. They were the first ones, I think. It was quiet for a long moment and then Kyoka asked, Were they kids? Nope. I think they are second years, Denki said through the walkie-talkie. It was quiet once again as everyone with a walkie-talkie processed that. It'll be fine, probably. Mina waved the concern off and placed the device on her hip before helping the two upperclassmen to the exit. Don't forget to tell your friends. She waved at the two girls as they left in each other's arms. Today is a good day. Mina nodded to herself with a smile. The day continued with excited students and people coming to 1A's haunted house after the first couple came out. The horror enthusiasts jumped at being able to experience a new haunted house to sat their horror fix. Most people were satisfied by the end of the maze, and the remaining few who weren't were very vocal about it. This is supposed to be a fun festival, not this, a higher-pitched voice shouted. A woman in her mid-30s with a sobbing boy at her side loudly complained to the two girls in charge of the haunted house, Yaoruzo and Mina. Yaoruzo was about to open her mouth to apologize, but Mina beat her to the punch. Who said it was supposed to be fun? It's a haunted house, it's supposed to be scary. Sure, some people find that kind of stuff fun, but to each their own. She shrugged. The pamphlet specifically said that it wasn't for any casual passers-by. She tapped on the pamphlets they made on the table. We even made a sign. The pink girl pointed at the sign on the table with big letters saying, "Super Scary," in red. We did make a sign, Yaoruzo mumbled with a nod. She was sent a glare by the woman and quickly continued. We are not responsible for each person who decides to go through. You decided to do so, and with a young child no less. While she did feel bad for the crying child, she did blame the mother for dragging them along into a haunted house. Are you calling me irresponsible? The woman said indignantly. Now you're putting words in our mouths on top of yelling unnecessarily. Mina crossed her arms and shot the mother an unamused look. The staff will hear of this, the mother said in a growl and left, dragging her crying child behind her. The few people who gathered to watch the scene parted to let her leave. Was that so wise? To antagonize her, that is? Yaoruzo asked after a moment of watching the woman go in a huff. She's one of those people who think the world will cater to their every need. Mina waved her friend's concerns away. Those are the worst to deal with. Yaoruzo nodded along. Yes, I've gathered that, but don't you worry that the staff will shut the haunted house down? She glanced at the large crowd lined up to go through the haunted house. Mina also looked around and hummed in thought. Probably not, it's too popular. The festival is supposed to be fun for everyone, and having to satisfy one to anger a mob isn't logical, as someone would say. She dropped her tone and added some gravel to mimic someone. Yaoruzo stared at her friend with pursed lips. You're picking up Midoriya's bad habit. Which one? She asked, confused. Being confrontational? No. Well, yes, but I was talking about you mocking or looking down on Mr. Aizawa, Yaoruzo explained. Mina stopped in her tracks to head back to her post at the end and turned to Yaoruzo with a serious look in her eye. I am aware that Eraserhead is a great hero, but Aizawa is a less than stellar teacher. Especially when he always is making sure my good friend doesn't turn and kill everyone. I don't see him do that to anyone else, and I don't think that's very fair. Yaoruzo stepped back at the sudden anger Mina showed. She gathered herself and responded. Aizawa doesn't do that to Midoriya. Mina cut her off before she could continue. He literally told Izuku that the only reason he wasn't expelled for the midterms was so the school could keep an eye on him. She took a step back and took in a breath before continuing. We should get back to our posts, and turned to leave. Yaoruzo was left there standing, unsure what to do next. She took in what Mina had said and tried to look at it from another angle, but if what Mina said was true, then she could see why their little group disliked Aizawa so much. And that was just one incident she was told about. Only Midoriya would know how many more. She finally turned and headed to her post at the beginning of the maze to welcome more people into the haunted house. The day continued with more people coming in and checking out 1A's haunted house. It was a little past midday where 1A decided to take a break for food. Most of them gathered up and ate from the stalls other classes had set up. Izuku's gang was seated at a picnic table with Eri at their leader's side eating a plate of fried squid. How is it, Eri? Izuku asked the little girl beside him. She swung her feet on the bench and took another bite happily. She looked up at him with a full mouth and nodded. Izuku chuckled and patted her head. Good to hear, take smaller bites. I mean, I've had better stall food, Denki complained while swallowing his bite of food. Makes sense it's not the best since a bunch of teenagers made the food. Sure there are a few who know how to cook but I doubt any of us know how to cook something other than cereal, Hanta explained. Everyone at the table turned to Izuku and he noticed everyone's eyes on him. He shifted slightly in his seat. Not my fault you guys burned boiling water. Mina slammed her hands on the table and stood up indignantly. That was one time, I went to the bathroom and forgot. Kinda weird that the water blackened the pot. You sure you didn't put anything else in it? Toru asked her friend. It was just water. Mina shouted to the sky. But what kind of water? Cold water, hot water, tap water? Denki asked and was subsequently hit in the back of the head for his question by Kyoka. Mina glared at her electric friend and took one of his skewers. I'm taking this. She used the meat and vegetable skewers like a nun would use a ruler on a disobedient student. She proceeded to take a bite and chew for a moment before looking at the skewer. You're right, it's not that good. That's when a loud laugh drew everyone's attention to a flamboyantly dressed man standing on nothing above the trees. Izuku immediately recognized him from the video Denki showed everyone, that's why he relaxed some. As far as he could tell, Gentle Criminal was a gentle criminal. He never intentionally hurt anyone other than some bumps and bruises while not even stealing property. Oh hey, it's that guy, Denki pointed. Should we do something? He looked at everyone but most especially Izuku for guidance. Izuku looked down at Eri who watched everything while still eating. She could sense Izuku being calm so she was calm too. Izuku shrugged at his friends. Make sure no one gets hurt. We're at a hero school with dozens of heroes. We don't have our hero licenses, just ones to help keep people safe, he said logically. Everyone nodded and began to make sure all civilians were pushed away from the villain. Gentle Criminal for his part began to shout out his thoughts on Hero Society. Izuku kept an ear open as he carried Eri to a safe place. Zuku, is that a villain? Eri asked while being carried to the building. It is. Izuku nodded while keeping his senses locked onto the villain just in case he changed his routine and began to become a threat. He is named Gentle Criminal and wants attention for some reason. Some people are like that. Pretty harmless from what I've seen. Eri nodded along and asked, shouldn't you stop him? You're a hero. Heroes stop villains. Izuku smiled at her. Not a hero yet, just a student learning how to be a hero. But there are heroes around to deal with him, so no worries. Once far enough away from any collateral damage, Izuku sat down with Eri at his side. He pulled out a juice box for the girl and gave it to her as they watched on. More and more civilians were escorted away while heroes tried to catch Gentle Criminal as he jumped around and was an all-around nuisance. Izuku caught on that his partner who films everything was missing and looked around to find someone with a camera. If I were to be filming, where would be the best spot? Izuku mumbled to himself. He looked up and there was a short woman on the roof of the building with a camera. Izuku debated with himself if it was worth it to go up there and take her out, but he was reluctant to leave Eri alone. He looked around and found Tsuyu guiding a small family to where the crowd was gathered behind a line of 1B students holding them back. After calling her over, he asked, could you watch Eri for a bit? He trusted Tsuyu with Eri both because she had taken care of children before and she frequently visited her at the hospital while she recovered. Sure, but why? She asked bluntly. Izuku motioned to the roof with his chin. Gentle Criminal always has someone recording for him and I found who it was. Tsuyu looked between Izuku and the unknown villain before nodding. Very well, I'll keep her safe. She patted Eri on the head. Thanks, Tsuyu. I'll be right back. Izuku smiled at the child. He absorbed the gravity around him and jumped up to the roof. He silently landed and approached the woman who was gleefully recording Gentle Criminal running around the heroes who tried to catch him while monologuing. The woman was short with a pink flamboyant outfit to match Gentle Criminal. She had a small duffel bag with her that contained a laptop with many devices Izuku couldn't put a name on. He was still wary of what kind of quirk she could have, so he watched for a moment longer before approaching her from behind. He didn't say anything and waited for Gentle Criminal to look at the camera. Gentle Criminal was laughing as he gave the runaround to a young woman flying in a dress. How is it that heroes have fallen so low? He gave a beaming smile at the camera and froze at seeing a young man behind La Brava. His partner caught the emotion on his face through the camera and began to look around but was stopped by a hand on her head. She yelped in surprise and froze. Could you please call your association over here? She tried to pull away and run but suddenly felt tired. Never mind, Here he comes. The voice said. Unhand her. Gentle yelled at Izuku in both fear and anger. She has done nothing wrong. Izuku filed that away. He doesn't want La Brava implicated in his crimes. You preach about gentlemanly behavior, but here you are ruining a festival. Seems a bit hypocritical, don't you think? Gentle ignored the rest of the heroes on the ground and landed on the roof across from La Brava and the young man. Who are you? Gentle asked. Flux, are you willing to surrender peacefully? Izuku asked with his hand still on top of La Brava's head. The young lady you have has nothing to do with me. If I surrender, will you let her go? Gentle asked with tense shoulders. That's not up to me, but I will say what I saw. Someone recording on a rooftop with multiple devices in her possession. Flux said with a shrug. Do you surrender? La Brava tried to fight, but more stamina was drained away. Gentle stepped forward at seeing La Brava move sluggishly but restrained himself. Yes, please don't hurt her. He raised his hands in the universal sign of surrender. The next thing he knew, he was very tired. Gentle criminal floated on the rooftop unconscious. Flux let La Brava go and grabbed Gentle so he wouldn't float away. He set the harmless villain down and stopped absorbing the gravity. He didn't have anything to tie his hands and figured anything less than a quirk suppression cuff wouldn't do anything, so he let it be. He turned back to La Brava, who was stumbling to her associate. What did you do to him? She slurred sleepily. Drained his stamina. He's unconscious, Flux said simply. He looked around and pursed his lips. Where are the heroes? They seem to be taking longer than usual. Did you have others with you? He spread his senses but found nothing unusual. Why? Izuku turned back to La Brava kneeling over Gentle criminal's unconscious form. Why what? Why did you talk him down instead of fighting like most others would? La Brava asked. Izuku shrugged, but she didn't see it. Because I do that for everyone. If they don't, then I fight, but I've asked everyone I fight to surrender peacefully. My tormentor, my opponents, villains, teachers, and even All Might. He said with a small smile at the memory of beating All Might with raw power. You'll be a good hero. La Brava mumbled. Izuku sighed. I hope so, he said to himself as the first hero arrived. Aizawa was the next one to appear as he swung up to the roof with his support gear. Had a nice nap? Izuku asked with a raised brow. What happened? Eraserhead ignored the quip and looked over the two incapacitated villains. Saw her recording, so I came up here. He came and I asked him to surrender. He did, and now we're here. He said plainly. Where's Eri? With Tsuyu. Aizawa nodded and made to take the unconscious Gentle criminal. Izuku jumped off the roof and landed easily. He made his way to where he left Eri. She was still in the same spot, but now with his friends gathered around the little girl. See, told you he would. Denki pointed at Izuku. I would what? Izuku asked the group. You would leave as soon as the other heroes began to arrive at the roof, Toru said with Eri on her lap. What happened? Tsuyu asked. The woman was the assistant to Gentle criminal. He saw me and then surrendered after I asked. Izuku summarized. What did you do to her? Honta asked first. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't do anything to her. Izuku said somewhat indignantly. Well, why would he surrender so easily? There must have been some reason he did. Mina said. I think he didn't want her implicated in his crimes. It's one of the first things he said. That's pretty romantic, Kyoka smirked. That could be a bomb of a song too. Izuku, would you surrender if I was a hostage? Toru asked sweetly. Of course not. I would burn everything away to save you, Izuku said, crossing his arms. He has such a way with words. Mina swooned and draped herself over Kyoka dramatically. I wish I had someone that would commit war crimes to save me. The group laughed at her antics and Izuku sat next to Toru and Eri. What's a war crime? Eri asked innocently. Nothing you have to know until you are older, Izuku said. After some time, the staff began to dispel the crowds and send them away from the festival. Since there was a villain attack, the rest of the festival was cut short. Most of the students complained but accepted the outcome of a villain infiltrating school grounds again. Izuku was sure something would come of that. This would mark the fourth time UA was attacked if you count the press on the first week of school. Not to mention this was a harmless villain just doing it for attention. That would make UA's security look like a joke. I suppose we should head back to the dorms, Mina said, getting up from the bench next to Eri, who was sipping on her juice box. Kyoka nodded. The rest of the festival is cancelled. That blows. I wanted to see what there was other than food. She sighed in disappointment. Honta and Denki looked at each other, and after a brief conversation with nods and shaking their heads, they sprinted off to where the food stands were. The rest of the gang just watched in confusion as the crowds began to leave the school grounds. The gang looked at each other and shrugged. They didn't have to wait long before the two were running back with their arms full of all kinds of food from the stalls they no doubt had taken it from. They both had broad smiles as they closed with their friends. I don't know about Yuji, he was cut off by another louder voice from where they had come from. Who took all the food? Denki's eyes widened just as Honta said, "Run for it." The two took off with Mina cackling while running behind them. Kyoka looked around frantically before deciding to follow her friends. Toru laughed out loud and tugged Izuku to run with them. Izuku didn't hesitate to pick up Eri in his arms and began to run with his girlfriend, laughing the whole while. Eri was nestled in Izuku's arms as he ran. Her braided hair flapped about with the wind and she watched as the scenery passed by in a blur. For the first time in a long time, she giggled and then laughed with the people who made her feel safe. She smiled for the first time in a long time. Izuku looked down at his arms where Eri was sitting up and laughing. The absorber joined her in joy at hearing her and seeing her smile. The rest of the gang heard and looked in their direction. It didn't take much for them to join in. The 7 of them sprinted across the grass field to the dorms, all the while laughing like maniacs. Back in Izuku's room, the gang was seated around a small pile of food Denki and Honta had stolen from the stands. Now, I'm not saying this is bad, but it could be better. It's missing something, salt maybe, Mina said with her mouthful of a meat and vegetable skewer. Izuku was eating one with mushrooms and had to agree with Mina. There's no spices to it. They just tossed them on the grill from the packaging. He still took another bite. I like the squid, Eri said, finishing another fried squid. Denki nodded emphatically. Squid had always been my favorite. I don't know what this is, but it's great. Honta showed a fried something held by chopsticks. That's tteokbokki. I wonder who made them. They're a South Korean food. I had them once with my parents. Toru exclaimed at the foreign food. It's like some spicy fried rice cakes, she said by explanation. I don't know how you all can keep eating, I'm stuffed. Kyoka leaned back on Izuku's bed with a sigh. Perseverance, Mina said and grabbed another bland mean skewer. Eri yawned at that moment and leaned against Izuku's side. He smiled down at her and got a pillow that Kyoka passed him for her. She took it and laid down next to him with another yawn. You're such a dad. Denki snorted a laugh after Izuku finished helping Eri lay down. Izuku blushed and shook his head. That isn't my intention, he said while absorbing the sound around Eri so as not to disturb her nap. I just wanted to mentor her, I guess. I didn't want to see her get thrown into the foster system, and with her quirk, it would have ended badly. He explained. Just joking, we know how it is. Denki waved to calm his friend down. Toru was about to speak when there was a knock on Izuku's door. Everyone looked at each other and Honta got up to open it since he was the closest. Midoriya residence, Honta said, opening the door. Uraraka and Tsuyu were on the other side of the door in their casual clothes. They had changed out of their lost spirit costumes. Uraraka smiled at them all in greeting and Tsuyu gave a small wave. We saw you all sprinting away from the food stalls and thought you all might have some extra. She asked sheepishly. We didn't get a chance to try the stalls. The villain attacked right as we were leaving to eat, Tsuyu explained. Of course, Toru spoke before anyone else. We still have tons left. Uraraka and Tsuyu smiled at the invitation. They walked in and the gang made some space for them to sit around the mound of food the other two had requisitioned for them. They dug in immediately by grabbing what caught their eyes and joined in the conversation fluidly with the rest of the gang. They didn't talk about anything of importance but just enjoyed their time as they whittled down the mound of mediocre food. Now, I'm not saying it was my fault the guy tripped on the rebar on the ground, but maybe he shouldn't have run his mouth about my family. Uraraka finished her story as everyone laughed at her actions. Mina gasped out a laugh and asked, Did he really say that about your dad? He did, the bastard. Luckily, We were outside the construction area, and his broken arm didn't reflect on us. She said smugly. Did your parents know? Denki asked. That used my quirk to raise the rebar so he'd trip. I think Da knew but kept his mouth shut. She grinned from ear to ear. I'm sure he wanted to do something similar but. She shrugged as an explanation. What about you, Hanta? Have you ever used your quirk like that and get away with it? Denki asked his friend. Hanta hummed in thought and looked up at the ceiling. Not really, I leave evidence way too easily. Although, I did once tape the floor with double-sided tape so a dick of a classmate would fall. He ended up breaking his nose and I ended up suspended for a few days. He finished with a grin. That's good. I've done similar things with diluted acid. Really easy to mistake it as someone clumsily spilling water if the acid is very fluid. Mina said with an evil grin. Now, you Toru, she said turning to her best friend. I've used my quirk all the time and gotten away with it. She waved her hand but only Izuku saw it. It's so easy for me. All I had to do was act like the bright girl that wouldn't hurt a fly. I've tripped so many of my classmates, you wouldn't believe me. I've also. She paused as if she was hesitant to admit it. She looked to Izuku for his reaction and he was only smiling at her. Stolen a few things. Nothing expensive. Just erasers, pencil bags, or a phone or two. She finished quietly and quickly. Kyoko was the first one to burst out laughing. A phone or two. She held her stomach as she laughed. The rest of the circle of friends joined in, much to Toru's relief. I gave them back. Well, more like placed them to be found. Almost all of them. Toru, you little thieving minx. Izuku, were you aware that your beloved is a kleptomaniac? Mina turned from her flustered invisible friend to her walking apocalypse of a friend. I figured it out when my wardrobe was missing a few clothes. Izuku smirked at Toru whose face was heating up in embarrassment. She covered her face with her hands. You knew, she whined. That's like normal relationship stuff. Denki waved off and then leaned forward. That's nothing compared to a couple in my old school. They were really close, which is alright. But the weird part was they used really odd pet names. How weird is weird? Suyu asked. I've heard my parents call each other odd things. Nah, nothing like these two. I've heard them call each other sweet blanket. That's not so bad. Hot cereal, spicy coffee, cold pillow, and more. Denki cut off Uraraka. Everyone paused to take that in. I mean, it sounds like things they liked. Hanta tried to side with the odd couple. Spicy coffee. Izuku wrinkled his nose at the idea of such a thing. There were so many weird names like that everyone thought it was a prank or something but no one ever asked. Denki shrugged. I'm pretty sure they are still together. I mean, cold pillows are nice. Uraraka defended. Isn't hot cereal just oatmeal? Suyu asked everyone. No, there has to be a difference, right? Like it has to have liquid milk still there. Oatmeal is more like a porridge and cereal a soup. Denki argued. Kyoko scowled at the electric user. I hate the idea of cereal being a soup. It shouldn't make sense. But cereal is a soup. Hanta nodded with Denki. We got off topic. Izuku, you're next. Between getting your quirk and now, did you use it in public and get away with it? Mina pointed at a startled green-haired boy. Izuku looked a bit sheepish. I'm always using it. Not the third eye thing. Mina interrupted him. I like to call it sixth sense but I don't count that. Actually, Denki and Hanta said at the same time with a nasal tone of voice and while pushing up imagery glasses. Izuku promptly shocked Hanta and froze the fried octopus Denki was about to bite. Anyways, he said smiling at the jest. I haven't stopped absorbing my footfalls or the static in the air. It's a small way to build up my reserves. Mina made a face of discontent. No, that's too subtle. What's something you did with your quirk that would have gotten you in big trouble? She leaned forward facing Izuku. Tell us your dirty secret. She said smiling seductively. Toru promptly shoved her face away. Well, you guys know about the lightning storm. He motioned to everyone but Uraraka and Suyu. He faced the latter too. Basically, before the exams I stood under a lightning storm and made it so I got struck, a lot. Mina quickly pulled out her phone and found the news article. She passed it to the two girls. Uraraka's eyes widened in surprise. That's so cool. I would say it was dangerous, but seeing as you can absorb it. Suyu shrugged. That was one. The other was when I discovered I could absorb electricity and almost caused a blackout in my neighborhood. Everyone stared at him in surprise. Denki broke the silence quickly enough. My whole family has done that a dozen times. He said, not too impressed. What happened? Toru asked by his side in curiosity. Well, I walked by a lamp post and felt the energy inside it. I couldn't resist. And began to pull, not knowing the houses around me were losing power. Izuku explained while smiling at Denki at the unintended pun. After some more chatting between them, Eri woke up from her nap and continued to snack on what was left from the food stalls. The other two girls were ecstatic to see Eri giggle and smile at one of Denki's bad jokes. All around, it was a great spring school festival. Most of the class was hanging out in the common room or kitchen when Aizawa came in to warn them about visitors. They all asked, but he didn't say who, and left soon after his announcement. The gang looked at each other and shrugged. It wasn't long before they got their answer as the wild pussycats walked into the dorms in civilian clothing. Rock on with these sparkling gazes. We've come to visit. Coming out of nowhere, stingingly cute and cat-like, wild pussycats. The four posed with Tiger holding a box of pastries. The class came together to greet them properly and small talk began between them all. Sato was the first to take the box from Tiger's hands. Everyone who knew Sato knew he wanted to judge the pastries, but no one said a thing. Most of the girls followed to have a bite. Izuku and the remaining gang stayed back for the most part. The leader of their little group caught Tiger talking to Katsuki. He caught the words, "Sorry," but that was enough for Izuku to understand what he was apologizing for. Ignoring the bomber, he caught sight of Kota peeking around Mandalay's leg. The child met eyes with Izuku and the older boy smiled in greeting. "Kota, nice to see you again. Thank you for the letter." He crouched down to shake hands with him. Kota looked away and shrugged. "It's nothing. Midoriya, check it out." He chose them himself. Mandalay smiled behind a hand and pointed back to the entrance where everyone's shoes were. A pair of small red shoes, similar to Izuku's quirkless shoes. Izuku smiled at the flustered boy waving his arms to block his sight. "Red is a nice color. Just like your hat." That eased Kota's embarrassment. Mandalay caught Izuku's eye and motioned him to the side. He followed her and she began with a bow. "I want to thank you for saving Kota and what you had to do so." Izuku felt uncomfortable at that moment at the sudden motion of Mandalay. Mostly because he had never been thanked for anything by anyone older than him. "All that matters is Kota is all right. Please, stand up." Mandalay obliged with a smile and they turned to the surprise noise from Denki, who was talking to Ragdoll. "He gave your quirk back." "What? No, I'll be doing office work when we start up again. I'll be an office cat." Ragdoll posed in a cutesy manner. "I was about to say something was fishy if All for One gave a quirk back so easily," Denki said. The team of four looked confused at his statement. Pixie Bob asked, "How much do you know of All for One? And how?" Denki pointed at Izuku, who looked back at the four who had questioning eyes. "I like to research quirks, and seeing someone with multiple quirks, I dug deep." He shrugged. "I like to share what I find with my close friends. Some of the stuff gets real dark." Denki shook his head. The four took that in for a moment before Ragdoll broke the silence. "Well, we better check up on 1B. We just stopped by to let you all know we'll be back to work soon." "Why now?" Yaoruzo asked. "So we stopped dropping in the hero billboard chart. We were at 32th and dropped down to 411th. Mandalay explained. Izuku scowled at the mention of the way they rank heroes. The four heroes didn't catch it, but Denki did. He didn't say anything but filed it away for later. The hero team leaves for 1B's dorms and Izuku waves at Kota before they leave. The rest of the class began to talk about the ranking while Izuku and the other two boys in the gang found seats on the couches. Toru and the other girls come back, each with their pastries and Toru with an extra for Izuku. He smiles at her and takes it. The boys look offended at the girls for not bringing them one like Toru did Izuku, and they just scowled at them. Honta and Denki sulked away to get their pastries. Once seated, Denki asked what he had seen earlier. "Izuku, do you not like the hero billboard chart? I saw you made a face when it was mentioned." The gang turned to Izuku, who was curling his lip just a bit. No, not really. I love heroes and what they stand for, but the Billboard chart makes it into a popularity contest. Sure, people will always rank heroes, but this seems too much like celebrities on TV. Heroes should be better trained police instead of what it is now. He said by explanation. I figured you would like the billboards. Mina asked. I used to, but there are a few too many people who become heroes for the fame instead of what it's meant to be. If you become the #1 hero, then it shouldn't be because you have better marketing people under your belt. It should be you become the #1 hero because you did your best in your job. Now, most of the class was listening to Izuku's thoughts on the Billboard charts. Many thought he had a point, but a few scorned him for his thoughts. Katsuki felt stiff as he recalled all the times he had said exactly what Izuku was disgusted by. Todoroki liked where Izuku's thoughts went and continued to listen. What about people who try to become heroes for the money? Uraraka asked near the gang more quietly than normal. Izuku looked at her and recalled the first time they spoke in the kitchen on the first night in the dorms. As long as you do your job, I don't see why that's so bad. After all, a hero's got to eat. Izuku spoke with the same tone but with understanding eyes. Uraraka smiled and nodded. She continued to eat her pastry. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't mind a gaggle of fangirls when I'm pro, Denki said in a way to break the tense air. You would, Kyoka said with scorn and jabbed him with her earlobes. Ah, one of these days I will send a current through them. Denki pointed at Kyoka while holding his arm. Izuku leaned back in his seat and finished his pastry with Toru leaning on his shoulder. While there were some bad days with Izuku dealing with Ua, he had many good ones thanks to his gang of friends and their nonsensical conversations from time to time. He would take the bad with the good since the good outweighed the bad. The glow from Eri's quirk died down and the little girl lowered her hands from the formerly potted plant, now a pot of soil. Izuku crouched down next to her and gave her a beaming smile. Wonderful. You didn't need any help that time. You're doing great. Izuku complimented her and patted her head. Eri shyly ducked her head at the praise but looked up with a smile. Thanks. It's been less than a week since the wild pussycats visited. The hero billboard will be coming up soon, but Izuku didn't much care for it. The only other thing to note was the elevated security around Ua after the school festival. Apparently, the villain duo that broke in was the last straw for the school board. They demanded Ua implement even more security, which surely hit their budget heavily. Now, it's a regular thing to see exam robots roaming the school grounds scanning constants for threats. In addition, Izuku saw a few people installing devices near the walls that showed Ua grounds. He guessed that they were some kind of sensors. The biggest thing for Izuku during that time was Eri. She began to smile regularly and he was overjoyed to see the usually quiet and reserved girl be more expressive. The rest of Izuku's gang was similarly happy for the child and they did their best to get her to smile even more by goofing off or messing around near her. I'm getting kinda hungry, how about you? Izuku asked Eri as he stood up. She tilted her head in consideration and shrugged. A little. He smiled and nodded. A snack it is. He led the way back inside the dorms and to the kitchen. Denki and Honda looked up from the kitchen counter where they were eating some chips while chatting and playing on their phones. The two waved in greeting at the absorber and child. Eri went up to the other two comfortably and was helped up into an open chair at the counter. Honda slid over the plate of chips to Eri without looking away from his phone. Denki pouted when his hand only met the counter. He quickly got off his seat and sat on the other side of Eri to gain access to the plate of chips again. Izuku looked through the cabinets for something healthier for Eri and asked the other two. What's going on? He caught a glance at the screens on their phones were the same. Honda hummed out, just reading if there was anything different for the hero billboard this year. Other than a new #1 hero in 30-odd years. He shrugged towards the end. Probably be Endeavor, right? He doesn't have the charisma of All Might, no one does, but he's in line for the #1 spot. Denki added. Izuku nodded at their statements and began to wash an apple for Eri. He began to cut it into slices as he spoke. Crime will rise, it's inevitable. All Might was a crime deterrent, one way too big. And what happens when that deterrent leaves a hole too big to fill? Crime rises to seep through the gaps. Izuku set the plate of apple slices in front of Eri. Denki nodded and then smirked at his friend. You'd be real good in a poetry club. Maybe ask Tokiyami, I'm sure he knows a few spots. Honta snorted and pointed at Izuku with a chip. That wasn't poetry, it was just idioms and metaphor speak. What did you call him? Denki asked in a horrible Texan accent. He ain't no idiot. He tipped an invisible hat in respect of Izuku. Denki got what he wanted as Eri giggled softly at their back and forth. The other three smiled at hearing her laugh and continued with their conversation. The night came and most everyone in 1A was gathered up in the common room to watch the billboard begin. Izuku was sandwiched between Toru and Denki on the couch with Mina playing on her phone seated at his feet between Toru and him. Everyone was watching the TV as the program began with the introduction of the host and moved on to notable events that happened in the past year. Most of it was focused on the battle between All Might and All for One. Clips were shown here and there with the final scene of the battle showing Yagi Toshinori standing victorious over a beaten All for One. The show goes on with the list of the hero rankings starting from the top 10 and going down. They didn't name them all but showed a list of them scrolling slowly down. After that, the main show began with the 10th spot. Yukio dropped a spot. Uraraka pouted at seeing her mentor drop in ranking. Tsuyu patted her shoulder. She's still in the top 10 at least, she said in comfort to her friend. They moved on to the other spots after showing a few clips of Yukio throughout the year. One after another, the top 10 were shown. Nothing too surprising other than Kamui Woods, a hero who was still a rookie 2 years ago and rose quickly to number 7. The rest of the top 10 were introduced with Hawks being pushed to number 2 and Endeavor at number 1. Izuku watched Todoroki from the corner of his eye and the thermal boy watched somewhat unsurprised. To Izuku's surprise, Todoroki turned to him with a question. What do you think of him? He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear it. Endeavor, Izuku asked and Todoroki nodded. He shrugged and turned back to the TV where they were showing Endeavor at the raid to get Bakugo free. He will need to adapt. Before, he could do what he wanted for the most part with his image. Now, he has to mold to what Japan needs. He has shoes to fill that he will never be able to fill. Even more, he will have to be careful with what he does. Everyone will be watching him more closely, he said to the listing classmates. Todoroki took that in and nodded in agreement. After a moment, he asked, would you be open to returning to Endeavor for an internship? Turning back to Izuku. Izuku pursed his lips in thought. I wouldn't mind a good fuel source, he said smirking back at the half-and-half boy. Todoroki gave a faint smile in return and turned to the TV as Yukio began to give a short speech and then Yoroi Musha at the number 9 spot. The heroes went down the line, each giving a speech until Hawks interrupted edge shot about how generic they had been. Izuku watches with some interest as the hero continues about the rating system for heroes. He listens absent-mindedly to the number 2 hero go on to a mini rant. Hawks was an interesting hero for Izuku. He had looked into the hero and almost always came up with nothing in his younger years. He had found out Hawks was taken in by the Hero Commission at a very young age when he found a newspaper clipping of a young Keigo Takami saving multiple people in a car crash. One particular picture shows the president of the Hero Commission talking down to Hawks. After that, he disappeared with his mother. No school records, no sports competitions, nothing to show Hawks existing. From what Izuku can guess, Hawks was taken in by the Hero Commission and groomed to be their next Lady Nagant. Once he had that thought, Izuku could see the act for what it was. He glanced at Bakugo and could only think he would be the same one day. His lip curled at the mere idea. Toru next to him placed a hand on his arm and he looked at her. She smiled and bumped her head with his shoulder. It pulled his mind off of Bakugo entirely. He smiled back at her and she leaned on him as they watched the hero billboard conclude. The next day came and went with nothing of note happening until late afternoon. Izuku and his gang of friends, with the addition of Tsuyu and Uraraka, were finishing up their homework in the kitchen when some commotion caught their attention in the common room. Aizawa was even in the dorms watching TV with the few in the common room. The gang looked at each other and joined them to see what was going on. The TV showed the news covering a battle between Endeavor and Hawks against Inomu. From what Izuku could see, the battle was fierce with many buildings in ruins. The absorber frowned at the damage and could only compare it to the damage the USJ Nomu could have caused if let loose. The Nomu that attacked Hosu were strong but nothing to the degree of the one shown on TV. It was flying around while pushing Endeavor to his limits. That's not to mention Hawks is on the scene, but he was shown focusing on helping people evacuate with his feathers. It was clear that the Nomu was not like the others. While it did have the resemblances of them all with the black skin and multiple quirks, that's where the similarities ended. The Nomu fought intelligently. It was very evident when the Nomu dealt a critical blow to Endeavor by slashing his face. What drew Izuku's attention was how the Nomu acted. It stood over a prone and vulnerable hero but didn't kill him. The Nomu's objective isn't to kill him, Izuku said out loud to everyone in the common room. Everyone turned to him and Aizawa spoke first. The Nomu didn't take advantage of Endeavor when he was down. He nodded in agreement. There were a few murmurs at that and Yaoruzo asks. Then what was its objective? No clue, but it's not like the others. It's intelligent, look at how it fights and the way it acts. Izuku pointed out as the Nomu looked around as Endeavor was still prone. At that moment, the number 1 hero erupted and attacked the Nomu once again. Endeavor launched himself at the Nomu and began to burn brightly in the sky with the Nomu's regenerated quirk fighting against it. Hawk's feathers joined the fight by helping Endeavor propel himself. In the end, the Nomu was burned from the inside out and his regeneration failed to keep up. Todoroki collapsed to his knees in relief at seeing his father survive the battle. But it was short-lived as another combative joined the battleground. Izuku recalled seeing the same blue flames at the training camp. Dabi was currently ambushing the weakened number 1 hero. It was important to tell what they spoke of, but it was clear Dabi was monologuing. Todoroki was stiff at seeing the villain and Izuku was reminded he was with the team as they kidnapped Bakugo from Todoroki's side. They didn't have much to worry about since Mirko arrived to save the 2 weakened heroes. Dabi didn't stay long and teleported with the help of another quirk. The room let out a sigh of relief at seeing the battle conclude with the heroes' victory. Todoroki was quick to make calls to his family and he moved away from the common room. The rest of the class began to disperse after a moment of quiet and so did Izuku's gang. A few short weeks passed after Endeavor's first battle as the number 1 hero. Izuku and his class were all grouped up outside in their winter costumes. Even with their costumes on, most were gathered up around Izuku. Everyone quickly learned the absorber emits an aura of warmth for his friends and they took advantage of that. Tsuyu croaked comfortably next to Izuku. Thank you for sharing your energy, Midoriya. Izuku smiled softly and nodded. I don't mind, thermal is an easy one to get. Toru was hugging his arm. I'm so glad I have you. While my suit is pretty weather resistant, it's still cold. How much thermal you got anyways? Denki asked not far from the center that was Izuku. Enough for 3 or 4, Izuku answered cryptically. 3 or 4 what? Jiro asked with narrowed eyes. Maybe 5, Izuku said unsure. Mina came up to Izuku and shook him by the shoulders. 5 what? Enough lollygagging. Aizawa's voice cut anything anyone was going to say. Everyone turned to see Aizawa and behind them 1B with Vlad King near them. 1B shows their superiority once again. A blonde boy from 1B shouted with manic energy. Aizawa quickly wrapped his capture tape around his mouth to shut him up. It's always the blondes, Izuku muttered under his breath and smiled when Toru snickered next to him. We will be doing an exercise with 1B and a guest, a potential hero candidate. Aizawa motioned to the side where Shinso Hitoshi arrived in a gym uniform and a capture weapon just like Eraserhead had. He goes on to introduce himself and makes it clear that he wasn't looking for friends on his road to becoming a hero. Honta elbows Izuku with a cheeky smirk. Remind you of anyone? His little gang snickered at the remark and Izuku frowned in confusion. He looked around at them and then turned to Honta. Who? Something to say. Aizawa's harsh voice cut Honta's response and the snickering was cut off. Everyone looked at him and he was glaring at Izuku's group. No one said a word and his glare slipped off of them. He went on to explain the reason they were there and what the exercise was. It was a simple battle between the classes. 4 versus 4 with Shinso fighting in 2 matches, 1 in each class. As he was explaining, Midnight and Yagi Toshinori arrived to watch the match. Izuku looked at the ball in his hand and looked around to find his team members. He hoped it wasn't Bakugo. He was leapt on by Mina, who cheered. Guaranteed win. Mina cheered as Izuku pulled the gravity from her so he wouldn't drop her. Mina, get off of me, Izuku said in a way that anyone heard would know this wasn't the first time she had done this. She was pulled off of him by Uraraka and her quirk. Guaranteed win, I hear, she said, smiling at the two of them. Their last team member joined, Mineta. He was a quiet and short boy who usually joined Kutra for lunch. He waved amicably towards them all. The four grouped up and began to make strategies. Izuku took the lead on that aspect. The first match began not long after the teams were set up. The first match was Denki, Kutra, Kirishima, Tsuyu, and Shinso against Shinshida, Rin, Saburaba, and Shiozaki. The match began with Kutra sending out birds for reconnaissance as Tsuyu leapt onto a wall and camouflaged herself to blend in while following her team. Shinso stayed a few steps back to let Kirishima and Denki take the front line. The first to arrive was Shinshida in his beast form already transformed. He quickly takes advantage of their surprise by attacking Tsuyu and Kirishima, who were battered to the side. Saburaba, who was riding on his back, traps Kutra with his quirk. Shinso takes his chance and uses Saburaba's voice to brainwash Shinshida. Denki, who learned a lot from Izuku's strategies, jumped and pulled Saburaba from Shinshida back to prevent him from waking him up. With an enhanced punch, Saburaba is knocked out. Shinshida is quickly tied up with Shinso's capture weapon and the two 1B students are dragged off to the jail. 1A regrouped and moved on to the rest of 1B. They stopped when they saw a wall of vines beginning to snake through the pipes that were the battleground. That looks terrifying. Denki pointed at the snake-like vines. We can't go through there. Tsuyu looked around and turned to Kutra, telling them Shiozaki and Rin were farther ahead past all the vines. She hummed in thought. What would Izuku do? Tsuyu asked. Burn everything, Denki said sardonically. Then he paused. Or rush them with overwhelming power. And, hey, look. We have more power, he proposed. So what? We rush past all this and attack? Shinso asked, waving his hand at the encroaching vines. Kirishima shrugged and nodded. That's doable. Denki nodded and clapped his hands. I'll bait Shiozaki, and he looked around and then pointed at Shinso. You'll brainwash her with one of their voices. He waved back at the jail cell containing Shinshida and Saburaba. Izuku has rubbed off on you, hasn't he? Tsuyu quipped with a smile. Denki smiled back. He's a good influence. Now, let's go. The team rushed forward with Denki in the lead. He brazenly attacked Shiozaki and was quickly wrapped up in vines. He tried to shoot out a bolt of electricity to Shiozaki, but vines blocked it. He tried to do the same to Rin, but Kirishima took care of Rin while Tsuyu wrapped him up. Shinso mimicked Shinshida's voice and she fell under his quirk. The match ended after that with 1A cheering for the first one. How do you all believe you did? Aizawa said to Group A, who had just won their battle against 1B. Amazing. It's a wonder how I haven't graduated early. Denki said pompously while combing his hair to the side. Aizawa narrowed his eyes at the arrogance but moved on when Tsuyu spoke. While we didn't choose a leader, I believe we did very well together. I didn't do too much other than support, but I felt good about my performance, Shinso added. Kirishima tossed his arm around Shinso's shoulder. None of that. You did great. You took out two of the big hitters. Without you, Shiozaki would have taken us all out, he said, beaming. The group talked about their performances in the trial as Vlad King scolded his group. Izuku meanwhile was taking mental notes about the trials that just concluded. He could see many scenarios in which 1 billion won or how 1A could have done better. He also put himself into a scenario where he would battle against the first 1B team. While he was in his mental world, Mina smirked at his usual antics and let him be. She had grown used to her friend's behavior and sometimes even tried to follow along with his muttered conversation, but always ended up losing track of what was going on. She was fine with that. Instead, she made her way next to the Gravity Girl and began to gossip and make small talk with the newest addition to their growing gang. The next combat trial was set to begin and everyone not participating focused on the screens. Yaoyorozu, Tokiyami, Yuga, and Toru against Kendo, Manga, Komori, and Kuwaro. You think your girl will win? Mina bumps shoulders with Izuku in question. Izuku hums in thought. Possibly. Both Kendo and Yaoyorozu will take the lead and have good heads on their shoulders, but I believe 1B will win unless they take out Komori quickly. She is pretty terrifying once you think about her quirk. If she is let to work her quirk, then there will be mushrooms that knock people out everywhere. Unless Yaoyorozu lets loose and begins to make truly nasty countermeasures against Komori. And I don't know how Kuwaro's quirk will react with Dark Shadow. I haven't seen too much of Manga's quirk, so that will be interesting to see. As for Yuga and Toru, in a direct fight, Yuga will be good range support with Toru sneaking to take out targets of opportunity. But, again, that will be difficult with Komori in the field. Mina nodded along with his observations. When he finally finished giving his assessments, she spoke. So first, quickly take out the mushroom girl and they might have a chance. If not, Yaomomo would need to pull out the big guns to win, even though I don't think she would. Uraraka looked between the two, still getting used to Izuku's tactical mind. I think I understand. Mineta nodded in agreement. The battle started with Toru getting rid of her boots and gloves and shooting off into the dark of the area. Meanwhile, Tokiyami moves forward with Dark Shadow scouting ahead. The quirk quickly comes back and attacks Tokiyami. It's revealed that Kuwaro had taken control of Dark Shadow. Yaoyorozu tries to contain the quirk, but it's no use, and creating light to subdue Dark Shadow would only weaken their team while providing shadows for the opponent. Kuwaro makes his move and grabs Yuga to capture him. He is dragged away as Tokiyami gives pursuit. As they battled it out, Toru slipped behind the battle to find Komori and Kendo moving forward. The two spoke as they moved and Toru made her move. Silently as she could, she stuck Komori 3 times. She then sent a blinding light everywhere, causing the two to become disoriented at the sudden attack. Kendo tried to grab Komori and get out of there with her quirk, but she swung at nothing in her attempt to grab Komori. Toru grabbed the smaller girl and quickly knocked her out while dragging her away to capture her. Kendo shouted in frustration as their plan B was ruined. Toru was ecstatic at her victory but reined in her exuberance to focus on her objective. She had learned much from Izuku and his tactical mind. When she proposed her plan to assassinate Komori, Yaoyorozu was reluctant to agree. The heiress gave in to the plan when Toru pointed out Komori was the biggest threat to them. When she had read Izuku's journal about her, she had been slightly off-put by what it said. Her quirk and skills could be put to use as an assassin, and a very good one. She didn't like the idea of her killing people, but when Izuku clarified that she could just take them out non-lethally, she was very interested. From there, Izuku had shown her a few things she could study to become adept at taking out people with her bare hands. Pressure points on the body were hard to learn, but she was eager to put her skills to work. With Komori taken out, Manga moves on the plan anyway to separate Yaoyorozu from the others. He sends a barrage of attacks with his quirk to keep her away from her teammates as they battle between themselves. Yaoyorozu is pushed back with the shield she created. It only gets worse as Kendo arrives to help Manga take out Yaoyorozu. With one last effort, she launched a bag containing items to help Tokiyami and Yuga capture Kuwaro. Yuga ends up getting captured again by Kuwaro as Tokiyami equips the thermal goggles to find Kuwaro. He shows his super move Black Abyss, Sabbath. With Dark Shadow covering him like an exoskeleton, their movement became blinding. He locks on his rival and quickly pushes him back, with Yuga sending a barrage of lasers to help. Toru ran back from dropping off Komori at the jail cell and found Yaoyorozu unconscious, with Kendo and Manga moving to help their teammates. She intercepts them quietly just as she did the first time round. This time she goes for the brains of the team, Kendo. With deft movements, she strikes at the pressure points to take out the arms and then puts the redhead into a chokehold, with Manga none the wiser of his teammates' assassination right behind him. Kendo tried to fight back, but with her arms unresponsive and her legs kicking futility, there was no way of escape. Once again, Toru internally celebrated her success but cursed when she had to drag the unconscious girl back to the cell she had just left. With a quiet groan, she got Kendo on her back and jogged away. Just as Kuwaro was beginning to lose, Manga showed up to help him with an onomatopoeia of light to push Dark Shadow away and give his teammate somewhere to use his quirk. Yuga shoots out lasers at Manga, but he is beginning to run out of steam due to the barrage of lasers he was already shooting out to capture Kuwaro. "Where's Kendo?" Kuwaro asked with labored breaths. He was also on his last legs due to running around the two who tried to capture him. Manga waved to his side and then an exclamation mark was shown on his head when he saw Kendo was gone. He looked around but there was no sign of their leader. With a blurred-out curse, Manga focused on their two tired opponents. Manga shot out onomatopoeia after onomatopoeia to push Tokiyami and Dark Shadow away while Kuwaro moved to capture a tired Yuga once again. It was inevitable as Yuga was dragged away for the third time and this time Tokiyami wasn't able to help him as Manga began to cage the bird-headed boy and his quirk. Then, Manga felt his legs go numb after a strike to his back. Strike after strike landed on his body with no one to see who it was. With a panic, he shot out an onomatopoeia that expelled a cloud of mist. Toru was barely visible in the cloud of mist. Like a ghost, she darted in and out hitting Manga's pressure points until the last thing he was her outline. Tokiyami and Dark Shadow broke out of Manga's cage as he was knocked unconscious. Many thanks, Prism. I am beginning to flag but I will do my best to put my fated rival in chains of the darkest black. Toru gave him a thumbs up that they could see for once due to the thermal goggles Tokiyami had on. Sounds good. Komori, Kendo, and Manga are out. All that's left is Kuwaro. I'll trail you and jump Kuwaro when I get the chance, what do you say? Tokiyami and Dark Shadow nodded in agreement as they began to look for Kuwaro. They didn't have to wait long as Dark Shadow was taken over again to attack Tokiyami. The goggles were smashed soon after and Kuwaro baited Tokiyami to fight. As the two fought, Toru snuck around trying to find Kuwaro but it was nearly impossible due to all the shadows. She only had one idea and quickly whispered it to Tokiyami as she ran past him to get into position. Just as Kuwaro struck out at Tokiyami, a blinding light expelled all the shadows including Dark Shadow. This caused Kuwaro to become exposed. Surprised at the light, he turned to it instinctively only to be blinded. Tokiyami took his chance. Without Dark Shadow he pounced and sent a barrage of punches at the defenseless Kuwaro until he was subdued and the blinding light subsided. Mina and Uraraka cheered exuberantly at 1A close success. Izuku was also relieved to see his girlfriend win her match. He smiled in pride at her accomplishment. The teams were dragged out and their respective teachers went over their trials. Toru was given many congratulations and Izuku was the only one to see her blush profusely at it. The next battle was interesting with Todoroki, Iida, Ojiro, and Shoji against Tetsutsu, Kaibara, Honanuki, and Tsunotori. Izuku had some disdain for Iida due to his family being able to get him free from any punishment due to going after Stain. He was also interested in seeing if his speed had improved. He was already aware of Todoroki's improvements since he helped take on any super moves that were thrown at Izuku. That was a great way to increase his thermal energy quickly. Ojiro was hard to gauge since he didn't see too much of the boy but he could see Ojiro become a lesser version of Mirko if only he had more drive to him. As for Shoji, he was interested to see how he had developed since his quirk could become very versatile. The battle was head-on with Tetsutsu leading the charge with the others behind him. Todoroki predictably froze the surrounding area which slowed Honanuki from using his quirk as effectively as before. This didn't slow Tetsutsu as he was pushed forward with the help of Tsunotori's horns. Ojiro was slowed in his movements due to Honanuki's quirk when he trapped the area around them. Kaibara moved onto Ojiro's position as Iida tried to help his teammates only to get trapped. In anger, he uses his super move early and escapes from Honanuki's trap. Due to Iida's speed, Honanuki isn't able to protect himself from the barrage of attacks from the speed demon. As they fight, Ojiro is pushed back from Kaibara's onslaught of Drill's hands. As Tetsutsu takes on Todoroki, Tsunotori fights Shoji at range with her horns. He defended himself with his arms but the horns began to push him back. At this time, Todoroki began to use his flames on Tetsutsu in an attempt to do something to slow the metal-covered boy. The wall of fire caused Tsunotori to pull back from Shoji and Tetsutsu to pause only to push forward. Instead of helping his teammates, Iida doesn't stop his attack on Honanuki and finally manages to knock him out and drag him to jail. This caused Kaibara to gain the upper hand on Ojiro who stumbles on Shoji and Tsunotori's battle. Soon, Shoji became a target of both Tsunotori and Kaibara when Ojiro was taken out by a well-placed horn strike. As Shoji takes 2-on-1, Todoroki begins to turn up the heat more and more to fight Tetsutsu, who doesn't relent. It wasn't long before he was using the same fire as his father used daily. Thanks to Izuku's help in pushing more heat out, his control was precise as he attacked Tetsutsu. It started to become effective as the metal covering him began to turn red. Iida returned from the jail to find Shoji on his back foot against Tsunotori and Kaibara's onslaught. He aggressively attacks Tsunotori, who doesn't see the attack come her direction until it is too late. She was launched away from the other two in the blink of an eye and knocked unconscious after a follow-up attack from Iida. This allowed Shoji to take on Kaibara without worrying about another. Suddenly, there was a massive explosion and the two turned to see a glowing red Tetsutsu being launched away from the epicenter. The battle was soon over with 1A winning, but it was sloppy. Aizawa wasn't too pleased with their performance and the lack of teamwork. Iida was especially reprimanded for his lack of restraint against Tsunotori and Hononuki, who were in the nurse's office due to broken bones. The next match was up with Monoma already running his mouth. 1A has no chance. Not only will they go against one of our illustrious recommendations students, but there will be no trust in the leashed dog. He pointed at Katsuki, who was looking away from them all. Izuku's eyebrow raised at the last comment and wondered if everyone knew about Katsuki, or maybe it was just Monoma finding dirt to throw around. Aizawa was close to quieting the blonde until Vlad made a zipping motion at Monoma and he relented from his boasting. Aizawa's eyes landed on Izuku and he could feel the question in them. Did he blab about Katsuki? Izuku's only response was a raised brow and a non-committal shrug. The green-haired boy turned from Aizawa's glare to his friends who were teamed up with Katsuki. He could only give them an encouraging nod. That was more than enough for Honta, who puffed up in pride, and Kyoka, who gave him a confident smile. The screen displayed the teams. Bakugo, Shiro, Juro, Sato against Tokage, Kamakiri, Awase, and Bondo. This time Uraraka came up to Izuku. How do you think they'll do? Izuku bit his lip in thought and hummed. Not sure. Power-wise, they can win, but teamwork will be an issue. There is no trust between Katsuki and everyone else, but maybe he'll just go on his own and thin the numbers for the others. Using people as sacrificial pawns is very looked down upon, young Midoriya, Yagi said, not far from their team. The only one not startled was Izuku, who didn't turn to address the former number one hero. Yet Night Eye is very good at it. Whether or not it's frowned upon, Katsuki will do what he thinks is right. It's always been like that, and if that helps the rest of the team, then it's only a benefit. Yes, if they all work together it would be wonderful, but there won't be any trust between them and Katsuki. He said as a matter of fact. Yagi's face creased in a grimace at the mention of Night Eye and the unsaid name of Mirio, who was not getting better. Nezu had chipped him in the conversation they had about One for All and what could be causing Mirio's degradation. To Izuku's surprise, Katsuki stayed with the team as they moved forward. Kyoka plugged into the surrounding surfaces to scout the area and was able to avoid an ambush set up by the other team. Katsuki quickly takes the lead in the counterattack. Honta splits off to provide support as Kyoka shoots out waves of sounds to disorient anyone she sees. Sato took up the charge to tank any hits meant for Kyoka. The battle was quick and brutal, with Katsuki letting loose and showing his proficiency with his quirk and tactics as he took on both Awase and Kamakiri. His attacks were relentless, with explosion after explosion raining upon the two. Honta swung from pipe to pipe in a blinding motion. Each tape found its mark and wrapped up a piece of Tokage's body like a spider. Bit by bit her body was isolated and separated from each other, all the while Honta let out one-liners much to the annoyance of Tokage. With the help of Sato using a piece of sheet metal as a shield, he and Kyoka beat down Bondo bit by bit. For every punch Sato sent, Kyoka sent a sound wave that caused Bondo to reel in pain from the opposite direction of Sato. The two worked in a synchronized motion to subdue Bondo, who was flagging quickly. Meanwhile, Katsuki bombarded Awase and Kamakiri without reprieve. Kamakiri had some success in fighting back, but the range kept him from landing any meaningful blows. This caused him to lose his cool and become sloppy bit by bit. Awase didn't have a chance to fight back at all as he was targeted from the start by Katsuki, so he could focus on the true threat that was Kamakiri. He did his best to trap Katsuki, but Awase wasn't able to do anything to stop the bomber. With his body warmed up enough, He sent one last powerful attack against Kamakiri which ended the battle then and there. Honda dragged a string of tape behind him. Stuck to the tape were dozens and dozens of taped objects. He grunted slightly at the weight and let out a sigh when he arrived next to Sato. He handed the tape to him and patted his large arm. So good news, we won. Bad news, Tokage's body parts are individually wrapped and it will take ages to unwrap her. Honda said sheepishly, and a pair of eyes and nose glared at him while floating next to his head. Kyoka nodded along and backed away. Your mess, you deal with it. Katsuki was already walking away and Honda took that chance to sprint away from Sato, who dumbly stared at the tape and the wiggling body segments. Sato then turned to Tokage's eyes and nose. He cursed the tape man and began to drag the tape along. The last group to fight was Izuku's against Monoma's team with Shinso on their side. Throughout the exercise, Izuku had been working on a plan with the others. He told them what he knew of their opponent's quirks and capabilities. Kodai, Shota, and Yanagi make a very good team on their own. With Yanagi shooting shrunk-down projectiles at us with double the impact with Shota's help, it makes a powerful weapon. Izuku said between rounds. Uraraka interjected. How would Shota's quirk work with yours? She punched into her hand for emphasis. Izuku hummed in thought. Most likely, I would be able to absorb the secondary impact as easily as the first. But, it would be best to avoid experimentation during combat. Mina nodded along. So take out Yanagi first, or what's the plan? She side-eyed their opponents from across the waiting area. If we go that route, then Monoma would have to go at the same time since he would copy Yanagi's quirk, Uraraka pointed out, and Mineta nodded in agreement. Izuku tapped his lip in thought. That's not to mention Shinso. Denki told me his quirk works by responding to him like I thought it did. To avoid getting trapped by him, we will only state things. No questions, only statements. If someone asks something, then we know where he is at. I'm sure he takes after Eraserhead's ambush tactics. He turned to eye the identical scarf that sat on both Aizawa's shoulders and Shinso's. Statements. You think that'll work? Mina asked. Izuku shrugged. Probably. They gave him a flat look and he raised his hands to appease them. It's not like I know how every quirk works. I can figure some things out, but mental quirks have always been tricky. Last match. Move to the starting positions. Vlad King shouted. The two teams made their way down to the area where they would be fighting. Izuku turned at hearing encouraging shouts from both their class and from 1B to their class. He smiled at seeing his gang of friends cheering for them. He even saw Toru take off a glove and send him a kiss that no one but him saw. His chest warmed at the display. Izuku examined the jail cell. Are we allowed to escape the cells? I think it's more of the idea of being captured than actually being contained, Uraraka smirked. All right, so statements only, and what's the plan? Mina clapped her hands. Izuku nodded and made a crude drawing by melting the concrete with his finger. He made 3 points signifying the trio most likely working together and then 2 dots away from the others. Those 3 probably will stick together, with Monoma and Shinso being the vanguard or more like scouts. You left to scout back at the USJ, Uraraka stated. Izuku nodded with a smile and backed away from the 3 before leaping with no gravity and a pulse of kinetic energy. Just as he thought, he could see 3 figures moving together with the other 2 nowhere to be seen. He could guess that the 3 saw him since a volley of projectiles was sent his way. Nuts, bolts, and other metal bits expanded to be bigger than he was tall. They all had a bluish glow, effects granted by Yanagi's quirk propelling them. A wave of thermal energy washed over the wall of metal and it liquefied before him. A blast of kinetic energy sent the slag away from him and his team in a shower of sparks and molten metal. He thought it should be cool enough that it wouldn't kill anyone before it hit the earth. With his scouting done, he dropped like a rock near the others. With a soundless landing, Izuku turned to his team. The 3 are sticking together and the other 2 are unknown. The other 3 nodded and he continued. We'll move together and I'll keep my senses spread to catch the 2. With that, they moved out. Their footfalls were silent as they walked. Their heads were on a constant swivel to catch any movement. It didn't take too long to encounter one of their opponents. Do you see any of them? Uraraka's voice asked near the group. Everyone froze and looked around to find who asked the question. Mina had come close to instinctively answering her friend, but thanks to Izuku's tactics she stopped herself. "I have a sense of range, I don't feel him," he stated quietly to his teammates. "What's the plan?" Mina's voice asked and no one responded. After a moment where no one made a sound, Shinso said out loud with his voice thrown. "You know, Midoriya, you kinda piss me off. From seeing you and fighting against you at the sports festival I knew you're kind. Arrogant, self-important, asshole who thinks they are so much better than everyone. And you had to show your great quirk on live TV no less. Typical," he finished with a scoff. Mina to Izuku's side growled in anger at the words thrown at her friend. He grabbed her arm and shook his head. She nodded and kept looking around. "We should move," she said and pointed to an open area. The team nodded and jogged quickly to the open area instead of the corridor of pipes. Shinso kept up with them in the shadows. "Surrounding yourself with your little followers just to say you've got friends. Pathetic, going so far to even get that invisible girl to spread." That's as far as Izuku let him talk. With mounting anger at the boy, he aimed his arm in a random direction and sent out a burst of sound energy that rattled the pipes and caused the area to vibrate violently. One burst after another, Izuku moved around his group to find Shinso. The latest burst caused Shinso to stumble off a pipe 5 feet off the ground and fall. He was caught right at the edge of the burst, which only caused his eardrums to bleed and his bones to shake. Shinso was disoriented due to the sonic attack and stumbled as he dodged out of the way of a lightning bolt that hit the pipe behind him. He quickly found cover behind another pipe and then kept running. Izuku didn't let him get off lightly as he grabbed a handful of rubber ball bearings and shot them in his direction. They bounced around the pipes and he felt a grim satisfaction in hearing a yelp of pain. As that went on, Izuku sensed another figure bolt in their direction. He felt Uraraka intercept who he guessed was Monoma. Mina moved to the front of their group just in time to melt large metal bolts and nuts shot at them from the arriving trio. A large cloud of white mist extended from Mina's arms to shield them from that direction. Metal came in and melted goo came out. As she did that, Mineta moved to the opening to the side where Mina's mist didn't cover and began to launch a barrage of his hair at the three opponents. Uraraka fought in close combat with Monoma, whose skin was metal from copying Tetsutetsu. She was careful to dodge any strikes while trying to tag him with her quirk. Just then, Shinso came back swinging on his support weapon from another angle. Izuku was impressed with the speed but focused as he shot out the scarf to wrap around Uraraka. She was made to trip and fall to the ground. Izuku didn't hesitate and shot out a beam of fire that vaporized the scarf between him and Uraraka, causing Shinso to stumble back at the sudden loss of weight. Monoma took the opening to rush at Izuku. The absorber's body glowed light blue from Monoma's copied quirk and he lurched forward towards his reaching hand. Not risking his quirk being copied, Izuku increased the gravity where Monoma stood, and he dropped to his hands and knees. Metal screeched as it ground against the concrete, creating sparks. Going with the momentum of Monoma pulling him, Izuku absorbed the gravity around them. He grabbed Monoma by the back of his collar and then threw him with a kinetic burst at Shinso. "Izuku! Some help!" Mina shouted as she was beginning to get overwhelmed by the trio, who were stuck in place due to Mineta but still were able to launch objects at her and the short boy. Mineta created a chain of his hair and launched it at the two prone figures Izuku just downed, trapping them and making them a non-issue for the moment. Izuku sprinted with kinetic bursts from his feet, and when he arrived at range of his quirk, absorbed the 3 stamina pools before him until they flagged almost immediately. They slumped their shoulders and took in ragged gasps of breath like they just had run a marathon. He completely drained Yanagi since he didn't know if she could continue throwing objects and get rid of their main ranged opponent. Mina ran to Uraraka to help her out of the scarf just as they announced the winners of the battle. The two girls whooped in victory and Mineta offered a high five to Izuku, which he gladly reciprocated. They moved on to helping the other team out of Mineta's quirk. Mina by melting them and Izuku by burning them away. As he was near the trio, he returned their stamina and they perked up right away. They gave their thanks to him. Izuku turned to Mina's raised voice over Shinso. "You have no right to talk about what you don't know anything about," she shouted at Shinso with fury written across her face. "Mina, let it be." Izuku tried to placate his friend as he hurried closer. While he was still angry at the purple-haired boy about what he was going to say about Toru, he knew it was a tactic to get him to respond to Shinso for his quirk. Shinso scoffed and made to get up. Uraraka stopped him by stepping closer, just as angry. Izuku, why don't you tell him when you got your quirk? I'm sure someone as arrogant as you wouldn't mind, she said with crossed arms. Izuku sighed. A bit over a year ago, 1B members and Shinso whipped their heads to look at Izuku, who steadily returned their gazes. You're a late bloomer, Shota voiced the thought on their minds. Shinso grimaced and looked away, realizing his mistake. Mina huffed an angry breath and turned away from them to head back. Uraraka joined her soon after. Izuku sighed again and made to follow. Monoma stood up and held out a hand to shake. No hard feelings, he said. Izuku raised a brow at the hand. My quirk can kill very easily. I can absorb, store, and release energies. That includes thermal energy in a person's body or electric currents in someone's brain. I caused Muscular to go brain dead at the camp when I had no choice, he said seriously. Monoma faltered at hearing his words and made to lower his hand. Izuku took it for a moment before releasing it. He stared at the hand and then Izuku. Why? He asked, confused at feeling the quirk copy. He shrugged. I've always liked quirks, and if I had yours I would do the same. Either to play with a new quirk or just to experiment. He moved around him to follow his teammates. I can't imagine what you wouldn't give to have something like his quirk, not to mention all for one's quirk. Mina teased him, back to her usual self. Izuku hummed in thought. It would be incredible to have such a quirk. My first thought would be to take all the quirks from every prisoner in the Tartarus. And then open a shop to trade quirks that people don't want. He smiled wistfully at the idea. Mineta hummed in thought. That would be nice to see. Especially those villains that are in there for life. I've got to ask, what shampoo do you use? When I went to burn them away, they smelled like grapes. It was really nice, Izuku asked the short boy. He blushed at the words and mumbled something before answering. It's natural. I don't use scented shampoo since my hair smells like that. A mutation from my great-grandmother's side. That's neat, Izuku said, interested in the quirk lineage. Uraraka tapped Izuku's shoulder tentatively and asked, Are you upset about what I said about getting your quirk? How they know and probably will tell others, she asked sheepishly. Izuku turned to her and shook his head. No, it's okay. It was only a matter of time until more people knew, and this is a good way to get the word out. It'll be easier to see everyone's true feelings about such things. I'm not upset with you, he smiled reassuringly. She smiled back and her shoulders slumped in relief. Good, I didn't want to lose such a good friend. The four arrived at the viewing area with everyone. The five others behind them moved to Vlad King while Izuku and his team went to Aizawa, who watched them expectantly. The four stepped in front of him like every other group had, and he looked over them. Mina began before Aizawa could start. I think we did great, she said, beaming. Why is that? He asked, unamused. Mina hummed and pointed. Well, for starters, Izuku made a good plan to stick together with the threat of a mini Eraserhead skulking around while countering his quirk. While he was the main cannon, we provided support by holding off the others like Uraraka did with Monoma when Izuku tried to take out Shinso, and me and Mineta held off the three who threw stuff at us. Also, no one on our team was captured, she finished, beaming. The gang of friends not only learned new ways to use their quirks from Izuku but also picked up some of his tactical mind. They absorbed everything he had to say on many topics. Most of the time they couldn't keep up with his train of thought, but the parts they did understand usually stuck. And Izuku was more than happy to explain his ramblings. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at her explanation. It seems classes have been a benefit for you. Nope, I learned mainly from Zuku, she said proudly. He's a really good teacher. Uraraka by her side nodded. Izuku felt warm at the compliment but didn't take his eyes off Aizawa the whole time. He turned to eye the green-haired boy. They didn't speak for a moment until Izuku broke the silence. You should teach Shinso how far he should goad someone in responding and with what words. It could end badly for him if he said the wrong things to the wrong people, he said evenly. Aizawa continued to stare at Izuku for another moment before speaking. Noted. Dismissed. With that, he turned to leave. Izuku scoffed and turned himself to leave with his team. He wasn't surprised they didn't get feedback from him given Izuku just beat his protege. He would have expected him to be more logical, but apparently not. The gang of friends returned to the dorms and made plans to rest for the weekend. Mina quickly proposed to play board games, much to Izuku's reluctance due to the last game ending with a table flipped, Denki crying in a corner, and a roughhousing session between Mina and Uraraka. He soon caved in when he got puppy dog eyes from most of the group. Later, Mina slammed her hand on the table and glared at Tsuyu, who had just taken the remaining money she had. "You're cheating. Where are the loaded dice? Shake your sleeves. Open your mouth. Where are they?" Tsuyu croaked contentedly and counted the colorful paper bills. "I'm wearing a short-sleeved shirt," she said deadpan. "So you admit it. I remember you can store things in that belly." Mina continued to accuse their friend. Izuku watched on with an expression that could only convey resignation. With a sigh, he let the argument go on. He would only intervene when it started to become physical like the other times. Toru was at his side, leaning into him while giggling at her friend's meltdown. The others were similarly eyeing Tsuyu suspiciously since they had all lost money to the amphibian girl. From the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Shinso come through the front door of the dorms and look around. Finding Izuku, he made his way to him. The argument stopped and everyone turned to him. "Midoriya, can I speak to you?" A pause. Privately, he looked at others seated around the coffee table and back to him. Izuku nodded and stood up, giving his money to Toru. He followed him out the front doors and into the darkening night. They stopped not far from the doors and Shinso turned to him. He shuffled in place and rubbed his neck, unsure where to begin. They stood there for a moment, Izuku not saying a word and Shinso opening his mouth multiple times to begin but closing it in the end. Shinso took in a breath and released it. "I'm sorry for what I said about you. After finding out you were a late bloomer, things make a bit more sense." Izuku watched him for a moment, curious about some things. "Why did you want to become a hero?" Shinso looked up at him and answered. "It's something I've always wanted. Now, more than ever. To give people with villainous quirks something to look up to maybe." He was quiet after that, thinking about his life up to that moment. "And you, why do you want to become a hero?" Izuku answered without hesitation. "To change hero society." Shinso raised his eyebrows at that. "Change it how?" The absorber hummed in thought. "To get rid of some aspects of being a hero and look to enforce others," he said cryptically. Shinso furrowed his brows. "Like what?" He shook his head. "Doesn't matter right now." He turned to leave. "As for your apology, I'll look past it for now, but I won't forget what you said about the closest thing I have for family. You should choose your words more carefully. If you say that to the wrong person, they wouldn't hesitate to kill you." With parting words, Izuku entered the dorms and absorbed the electricity contained in his hand. It was a failsafe. He was sure falling under his control would make him lose focus on his quirk, causing the energy to shock him awake. He didn't trust Aizawa and Shinso as his apprentice would jump at the chance to help his teacher. Putting those two out of his mind, he returned to see Denki behind, manhandled by Mina, who was yelling something about being given what was owed to her. Normally, being so late in the winter months, people would wear thick jackets to ward off the cold, but Izuku and his gang of friends just huddled around him for warmth that he radiated with his quirk. It started one weekend when Mina loudly complained she was bored and hungry, which roped in Denki to follow her lead. Then they roped in Hanta. By then it was too late to change plans. The original gang of friends, with Uraraka and Tsuyu joining in, left the dorms and weathered the cold for some fast food. With just under half the class, the group trudged to the nearest fast food joint. It didn't take long before Mina figured out their illustrious leader was radiating heat for both Toru and Tsuyu. Toru was hanging off his arm like usual and Tsuyu was close to his other side, croaking contentedly. Mina wanted to be warm as well and not so subtly got as close as she could to his back. From there it evolved into everyone crowding Izuku as they walked. Like a mob of meerkats, they shuffled along into the restaurant. They soon detached from one another when the warm interior hit them. Since it was so cold, the restaurant was mostly empty to their delight. Izuku kept his smile on his face as everyone detached from the walking group hug. He felt very contented while being the center of the shuffle. While he knew it was for the warmth he radiated, it felt nice to be close to everyone he considered family. "We're lucky the wind was light," Toru said by his side. "Otherwise, that wouldn't have worked as well as it did." She giggled as she took off her scarf and pulled off the earmuffs on her. Mina twirled around to face the gang and pointed at Izuku. No, luckily, we have our space heater to keep us warm, she said beaming. Izuku raised an eyebrow and gave her a wry grin but didn't say anything as Honda jumped to his defense. That space heater is also your boss. Show some respect, he said while leaning on Izuku's shoulder with his elbow. The height difference was just perfect for him to casually loom over Izuku. He jolted away when Izuku zapped him with the equivalent of a static shock. Kyoka shook her head at all of them and made to order her fast food. Uraraka and Tsuyu chuckled while joining Kyoka. Soon the rest of the gang joined them and argued about what to order. I want tons of fries, Mina contemplated while tapping her chin. Can I order a tray of fries? She asked. I'm not ordering fries then, Denki said. Instead I'll take another order of nuggies. He nodded. Mina turned to him, an offended look on her face. Who said I was gonna share my French? Denki curled his lip at her in a frown. Then you won't get any of my nugs, he said, threatening and crossing his arms. As those two argued about sharing food, the rest of the gang ordered peacefully and let the most childish ones of the group bicker. One by one, the group ordered and took their order numbers to wait. The two finished their dealing with a handshake and moved to order with their resolve firm. The gang found a spot for everyone to sit together and wasted no time digging into their meals. As she said, Mina ordered a tray of fries and a milkshake. She also had a few chicken nuggets from Denki as he munched on the tray of fries, and their negotiations came to a resolution. Of course, their deal didn't account for the rest of the gang stealing the occasional fry. Most floated away in an invisible hand while Mina looked away. They let out a sigh of contentment when they finished their food. They looked outside as they let their food digest to see a few snowflakes beginning to drift down from the sky. Toru was under Izuku's arm as he continuously radiated some heat both for her comfort and Tsuyu, who was seated on his other side. The weekend came to an end and the gang was grouped up around Izuku once again as he radiated heat for his friends as they waited outside in their costumes. To their surprise, Mt. Lady came in with Midnight following behind her. Aizawa explained what she was doing at UA and how she was a guest lecturer. Mount Lady explained her role and how she would help in showing how they should comport themselves during an interview. Izuku curled his lips slightly at hearing they would be working on their publicity. Toru slipped her hand into his and squeezed to ground him. He smiled appreciatively at her for being able to see his problem with the current situation. She knew his distaste for the popularity contest that was hero business, most everyone knew. Todoroki was the first to the stadium as Mount Lady interviewed him. Sadly, he was terrible at it, but they continued. She asked him to show off one of his super moves for the cameras, and he obliged by sending an iceberg into the sky. I call this heaven-piercing ice wall, Todoroki said calmly. After telling the class to show off their less destructive super moves, they moved on. Tokiyami brought up a point that Izuku agreed with. Is it such a good idea to show our powers for everyone to see? It would make it easier for a competent villain to figure out a weakness from it, Izuku added, and Tokiyami nodded in agreement with his additional statement. Mount Lady answered, while true, being a hero will put you in the spotlight one way or another. Not even the ever-elusive Eraserhead is hidden, she said with a smirk at the grumpy hero. But showing off what you can do will make them more recognizable, easier to team up with, and a reassuring presence to the public. Shouldn't our actions reassure the public instead of whatever face we put on for the camera? Izuku asked. Mount Lady tilted her head back and forth at the question. It's both. Whether you put on a face for the camera is up to you, but yes, your actions will speak louder than words, she said, looking at Izuku. He nodded at the answer. Even though he didn't like the public part of being a hero, he did appreciate Mount Lady's ability to work with it. One by one, 1A tried their hand at being interviewed by Mount Lady. Some went better than others. Notably, Bakugo was straightforward with his answers and quiet as he answered anything the hero asked him. Even when she poked at him and Izuku expected to see him snap at her, he didn't. It was surreal to see Bakugo like that. He pushed what he thought of him away and went up to the platform for his turn. Now to our last interview. What should we call you? Mount Lady held the microphone to Izuku. Flux, he said simply. She hummed in interest at the name. How did you come up with such a name? It's short for fluctuation. I will always cause the energy around me to fluctuate, so flux. He said lamely. Mount Lady gave one of those fake laughs you would hear from a news reporter and moved on. Well, show us one of those fluctuating energies. Izuku hesitated in choosing what to show. All of his super moves were destructive and his void domain was hard to see. He chose to show nuclear immolation without the nuclear to conserve the scarce energy. He created a bead of pure thermal energy. It blazed like the sun as it manifested in his palm. He aimed it at the sky and released a pinhole of the bead for the energy to escape. Liquid-like fire screamed out of the hole as the area around them heated up. Mount Lady stepped back at the show of power. He cut off the release and then sucked back what thermal energy he could. The boiling air froze and the area cooled significantly as frost covered the ground around Izuku's shoes. I called it nuclear immolation, but without the nuclear since I didn't have much to use, Izuku said as he cracked the frost on his body that built up. Then it's not nuclear immolation, is it? Denki said out loud like a heckler. Izuku's eyes crinkled as his half-mask hid his smile at being heckled by his friends. I suppose not. Mount Lady looked at the warm expression he showed for a moment before turning to her again with a flat expression. Classes ended not long after that. Back at the dorms, Izuku sat to relax on the couches. He only notices the buzz of activity when he looks around. Most of his classmates were hurriedly setting up decorations. He only then realizes, after seeing the Christmas decorations, that it was soon Christmas. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth at remembering his past Christmases spent alone, watching movies, and opening gifts left to him by a mother whom he hadn't seen in years. Like all things, it started slowly, but year by year holidays didn't have that special meaning anymore for him. He felt awkward at seeing everyone work at putting up decorations and not knowing what to do with himself. Even the ever-stoic Todoroki knew what he was doing. He could imagine his sister or brother dragging him into helping. Izuku, feeling uncomfortable, began to slink away to his room until Honta shot a strip of tape around his waist and dragged him closer. "You're not going anywhere," Honta said, grinning in a Santa Claus hat and a red coat. He yelped as he was pulled closer and then, with the help of Denki and Mina, forced clothed in a red coat like theirs. "Just relax and maybe you'll find yourself under a mistletoe with Toru," Mina whispered into his ear and giggled. He felt his face flush at the implication just as the girl in question rounded the corner in a red hat and coat just like the rest of them. She was carrying gingerbread house supplies with Kyoka. As she locked eyes on Izuku, she beamed at seeing him in the coat like everyone else and joined them. Uraraka and Tsuyu joined them with Eri between the two. She was looking around at the decorations with wonder. "Izuku, why didn't you tell me about Christmas?" Eri said, running up to him and looking around. Izuku stammered, I forgot, sorry, I see you are all dressed up though." He quickly changed the subject as to why he had forgotten. Eri nodded vigorously. "Sue said we can build bread houses and then watch Christmas movies on Christmas." Denki nodded as he set up the gingerbread house kits for them. "Well, we could do that anyway." Kyoka's earplugs stabbed him and he sent a small shock through them, causing her to yelp and pull back. "Ha, I told you I would do it," he said, pointing at her. "That hurt," Kyoka said, rubbing her earplugs and glaring at him. Uraraka rolled her eyes at the pair and turned to Eri. "It's a great time of year. We'll show you as much as we can." Toru hooked her arm with Izuku and sent him a questioning look before she understood his mood. She then had a sad look as she tightened her grip on his arm. "It's fine, it's better now," Izuku said before she could say anything. "It's better than any Christmas I've had in a while." He patted her arm reassuringly with a smile. "Okay," she said simply and hugged him. The day continued with the class doing all the things they did during Christmas. Izuku could only follow along with Eri at his side, just as thrown off by the sudden holiday. The first thing they did was to build gingerbread houses. Izuku had only seen that in movies and books, so he just copied whatever everyone else was doing. He didn't understand how gingerbread was related to Christmas, but he didn't ask. His house should have looked like the one on the box if it wasn't for Toru taking bites out of his building material when he wasn't looking. In the end, it looked like a shack with too few drop bushes and not enough gingerbread to provide shelter for his gingerbread men. "I hope you're happy. Ginji is going to succumb to the elements because he doesn't have proper shelter." Izuku shot at his girlfriend. She swallowed a mouthful of presumable gingerbread and answered, "Well, he can come over to my house. Let's just do this." She grabbed his gingerbread shack and set it on her much nicer plot of ginger land and connected the two structures to make one. "There. Now I've subsidized your property. I demand a rent of 3 gumdrops each month." "You mean those 3 gumdrops you've stolen from my land?" Izuku asked with a smirk. "That was the property tax," Toru said, stuffing her face with one of the said property taxes and smiling. "You bastard. Tally-ho." Everyone at the table turned to Denki and Honta, who were shooting hard candies at each other's gingerbread fortresses in an attempt to destroy one another's. Denki flicked one candy with his quirk hard enough for it to shoot through the gingerbread battlement and strike one of Honta's gingerbread men. "Reginald, no," Honta mourned over his downed soldier. Then he aimed his candy cane catapult and shot. Uh-oh. He overshot Denki's fortress and hit Uraraka's pristine gingerbread house. The shot was too good and the foundation was not solid enough as the gingerbread house collapsed under Uraraka's careful hand. Everyone froze as they stared at her collapsed creation. She turned a murderous glare at Honta. He wilted under the glare as she stood up. She placed her hand on the table and it glowed pink for a moment before she touched Honta's gingerbread house. It glowed dark purple and then it smashed down under its own increased weight before she released her quirk. 23 lives were lost this day. 17 leave grieving widows and 2 orphan children. Honta said softly as he stared at his flattened fortress. He picked one piece of gingerbread and ate it. "You'll not be forgotten," he said while eating as Denki patted his shoulder in solidarity. "How's this?" Eri asked. Her gingerbread house looked pristine compared to everyone else's. Suyu patted her head. "Wonderful," she croaked with a smile. Later that day, the gang was grouped up in Izuku's room to watch old Christmas movies with Eri glued to the screen. Toru was under Izuku's arm as he enjoyed the holiday for the first time in a long time. It was getting late, so when the movie finished, he took Eri to get settled into her bed. After slipping out of her room quietly with the help of sound absorption, he passed the common room to return to his family in his room. Todoroki caught his eye and motioned him to the side to talk. "My father sent you an invitation to return for an internship if you're interested. But, I think you should know he sent an invitation to Bakugo as well and accepted it," Todoroki said calmly. Izuku pursed his lips in thought. He had to admit Endeavor did have some qualities to him that Fat Gum didn't. But he liked working with Fat Gum so much more. And then there was Katsuki he would have to work alongside. While he didn't think he would cause problems, he just didn't want to be near him more than he had to. But Fat Gum didn't release thermal energy like it was going out of style. Not to mention Endeavor was a combat hero in a populated city with so much energy. The absorber nodded slowly. "All right, I'll join you." Todoroki gave a faint smile and nodded. "I'll inform my father." With that, he turned and went to his room. A few days later, Izuku nervously stood next to Toru. "Are you sure this is okay?" "Izuku, I am not going to leave you alone while everyone else goes home to their families. I offered first, but the others were just as ready to invite you to their homes if things didn't pan out on my end." Toru scolded him and dragged him off the train platform with ectoplasm escorting them for security. Izuku felt warmth fill his chest like thermal energy never could as he thought his friends lining up to invite him to their homes for New Year's just so he didn't end up alone. He cleared his throat and rubbed his eyes at the idea of it alone. Toru stopped and pulled him into a hug without asking. When he felt more composed, the two continued down the street until they reached a modern home. Toru didn't knock before opening the front door and waving at ectoplasm in thanks. Izuku took in a deep breath before tentatively following Toru into her home. "Toru, Nagai, the invisible girl's mother," exclaimed and hugged her daughter with joy. Toru hugged her back just as tightly and turned to drag Izuku further into the house than just the entrance. "I brought Izuku just like I said." Nagai smiled warmly and hugged Izuku just as she did with her daughter. "Welcome. Please make yourself at home. I'm so happy to have you two be able to join us for New Year's. I can't imagine how busy you guys must be with being students and all the training," she said, all the while smiling and pushing them into the living room. Izuku felt flustered at the warm welcome and then abruptly moved to sit across from Toru's father, who was under a kotatsu, a heated table covered with a blanket. Toru hugged her father just as tightly as she did previously with her mother. He felt a pang of jealousy at seeing such a close family but shoved that thought away viciously. Makoto, Toru's father, greeted Izuku with a smile. "How are you two doing?" He looked between the two teens. "I don't have to worry about any unexpected grandchildren, do I?" "Dad," Toru exclaimed and slapped her father's arm in embarrassment. Izuku's face bloomed in heat just as much as Toru's by his estimation due to all the thermal energy radiated from her. "No," he quickly said. Nagai chuckled softly and set down a tray of tea and cookies for everyone. She bopped her husband on the head as she joined them under the blanket. "Leave them be, I'm sure they are being responsible." "Right." She paused at mid-pour and looked between the two. She smiled and continued pouring tea at the expression on Izuku's face and the noise Toru made. "Good." The two adults teased Izuku and Toru for a bit longer, then moved on to talking about more mundane things like the grocery store that was being built near their home or the gossip around the neighborhood. The family included Izuku in every conversation and asked him for his opinion. He felt warmth fill his chest, and it wasn't just from the heated table they sat at. He felt the missing piece of being in a family that he missed for so long, slot into place when he spent time with Toru and her parents. He smiled more and more as the day passed. Not once did they bring up why Izuku was spending New Year's with them instead of his own family, and he was relieved for the lack of questions. He had to wonder if Toru told them in advance some bits and pieces of his past or just told them not to ask questions. Either way, he was happy. Nagai and Toru shooed Izuku out of the kitchen when he offered to help cook dinner. He didn't try and fight them and just sat with Makoto on the couch. They chatted about some politics and Izuku gave his opinion on the topics, though his usual cold responses were watered down greatly compared to what he had said before at Ua. When dinner was eaten and everyone was set to go to bed after letting the food settle, Nagai spoke up about the sleeping arrangement. "How do you guys want to do this?" When she got confused looks from the two teens, she rolled her eyes and huffed out a breath of amusement. With a smirk, she looked at the two. "You've been sleeping under the same roof for months. Can either of you two look me in the eye and tell me neither of you snuck into the other's bed at night?" Izuku's face heated and he looked away while Toru squeaked softly. "We haven't done anything," she exclaimed loudly. "I never said you did, but I know my daughter. Sleep however you like is all I'm saying," she said, grinning, and patted Makoto's arm as they made their way to their room. He made a sound of protest, but he was hushed by his wife. Toru huffed, and then after a quiet moment between the two just standing there, she grabbed Izuku's arm. "Come on, I haven't shown you my room yet." She looked back at him and smiled at him. He smiled back with the residual heat on his face dissipating. The room in her home was stripped of most things. They had been moved to the dorms. It still had the furniture, but most decorations were gone. The two of them were already changed into their pajamas and ready for bed, so Toru wasted no time in pulling Izuku to the bed. She positioned herself in front of him and laid down comfortably after placing his arm over her. She hummed in contentment as Izuku laughed softly and hugged her. The small family and Izuku woke up early the next morning to visit a shrine. When quirks became more commonplace, people visiting shrines became less common. Even then, many people were at the shrine they arrived at, all lining up to pay their respects. Toru dragged Izuku to the stalls to buy some hot drinks, even though he was radiating enough heat to ward off the cold for her. It was a festive atmosphere and peaceful as they lined up with the Hagakure parents. Their time came and Izuku followed traditions, even though this was the first time doing such. He knew the traditions and bowed his head in prayer. "Help me keep the ones I love safe." "Welcome back, Flux, and welcome Katsuki." Endeavor greeted the two hero students. A day had passed since Izuku had gotten back to the dorms with Toru, and he was in front of Endeavor once again. Izuku eyed the large scar on Endeavor's face due to the Nomu he fought off with Hawks. "You seem chipper," he said hesitantly. His mood shifted and went back to his normal ways. "I only accepted you two since Shoto asked me to. I would have rather had Shoto alone." "Well, they're here, so deal with it." Shoto shot back to his father. While it was rude, it wasn't like before the sports festival when he would have said it with vitriol. Yes, he waved Shoto's concerns off. Katsuki stayed quiet the whole while and Endeavor looked at him. He stared at the blonde for a moment before looking at Izuku. "Your profiles note that there is heavy animosity between the two of you. Will that be an issue?" Izuku didn't even glance at Katsuki as he answered. I know when to be professional. Same here, Katsuki grunted. The number one hero looked at them for a moment longer before nodding. Very well. Then let's get going. He paused as he listened to his earpiece and then began to run. Keep up, he ordered over his shoulder. Izuku didn't need any of his hero uniform to use his quirk, so he didn't equip anything like Katsuki or Todoroki did as they ran after Endeavor. The number one hero looked like he was trying to outrun the students, but Izuku could see it was more of a hurry to get to the scene before anything occurred. To keep up while adding to his energy stores, he absorbed the gravity in his immediate area and blasted concentrated kinetic bursts for propulsion after Endeavor. It was still chilly, so he released some thermal energy for comfort as he followed the hero. Endeavor glances over at Izuku but focuses back on the man in the sky not too far ahead. Glass from the surrounding buildings was pulled to him and then launched at the streets while rambling about the end time, like a lunatic. Endeavor moved to intercept the attack with a flaming fist and Izuku rocketed to grab the villain. He tried to go into an alleyway but slumped limbless as Izuku reached his area of influence, his stamina drained into unconsciousness. Izuku stopped his momentum by touching the building wall and absorbing the kinetic energy from himself. He looked down the alleyway to see Hawks with others similarly dressed like the villain. Damn, you're sure quick, Hawks praised Izuku with a lazy grin. He poked the head villain with his boot. What did you do? I'd like to know that as well. Endeavor came up behind Izuku. Absorbed his stamina, Izuku said plainly as Katsuki arrived with Todoroki. He'll wake up exhausted. Hawks quirked up an eyebrow. So, what, you've got his stamina now? Izuku nodded. Very useful to stay awake an extra day or boost your energy. He showed it by sending a small bit of stamina to Hawks. He visibly perked up and shivered. Holy hell, kid, he looked to Endeavor. I want him. He can replace my coffee. Granted, I'll still drink it, but damn, that's way more effective. I'll give you anything, he pleaded to the number one hero. Endeavor crossed his arms. If you needed to contact me, you could have just done so, he said. Izuku watched on quietly as he tried to understand what was going on between the two. Hawks shrugged. I was just passing by. The police come up at that moment and begin to take away the villains from Hawks and Izuku. He tells the police what he did and they nod to pass along Starservant's condition. You know, Tokiyami told me a bit about you, Hawks said to Izuku. He says that you're a very knowledgeable person with awesome power. What do you think of that? He asked curiously, leaning closer as if he could see into Izuku's mind easier. Izuku watched him in return. I like information and do have information about many things and people. From villains to heroes to people of power. Whether that information is of any use. Izuku shrugged and didn't mention the second part of Hawk's question. The number two hero hummed and leaned back. He posed with his hand on his chin and nodded. I like you. Tell me what you think of this. He handed over a Meta Liberation War book from his jacket pocket. He took the book and looked it over before looking back at Hawks. I think the idea is nice but would need lots of regulations for it to work. Infrastructures would have to accommodate even more than what we have. Lanes for speeding people, strengthened roads for giants' transformations and their weight, a new police force between heroes and what we have now just to keep up with people flying or leaping from building to building. Those are just the transportation changes. What about the idea of people using their quirks for work? Jobs will become a premium for those who have the right quirk and those who don't will be kicked to the curb. If this would ever come true, then it would have to become a gradual change over decades. The ideology of Destro is not a bad one, but his ideas have been twisted in recent years. Izuku stopped his lecture and flipping through the book to look at Hawks. Hawks was back to leaning forward in interest at what the young man was saying. Go on, what was changed? He asked. The absorber took note of Endeavor, Katsuki, and Shoto being near and listening to their conversation. He pushed them out of his mind and focused back on Hawks. The newer ideology of the followers of this book think more radically. It changed from being free to use quirks as a human right to a hierarchy of stronger quirks to weaker ones. A caste system where I would be a young master at the higher tier while we watch over the lower castes. That's not to mention when a young master becomes too strong for the great masters and they decide they don't like the threat of the young ones becoming too strong. keep the status quo. Then we slowly slink into getting rid of those rising masters. And that's all while ignoring the quirkless, they would be eradicated one and all. Young master, you think highly of yourself. Hawks tried to joke, but inside he agreed with everything the young man said. Izuku shrugged and handed the book back. I'm the top of my class, it would only make sense. Hawks took the book, wrote something on the inside, and handed it back. For my fan, he said, winking, and moved to talk to Endeavor. Taking the book, he looked inside to see Hawk's phone number and a note to contact him if he ever wanted to debate or chat. Izuku hummed in thought and watched Hawks pull out another Metal Libration War book and handed it to Endeavor. This one looked more worn and had dog-eared pages with post-it notes in between. He took all that in with interest and slid the book into his briefcase with his hero suit. The 3 students arrived at the agency not long after. Endeavor left the 3 to read the book while his sidekicks greeted the trio. Izuku had met most of the sidekicks of Endeavor the first time around. Burning wasted no time in greeting Izuku by pulling him into a side hug. Is that a smile I see? Who are you and what have you done with that brooding boy from before? Burning poked and prodded him in good nature. She stopped and looked closely at him before laughing. It was that invisible girl, wasn't it? She said, grinning. Izuku smiled softly and nodded. In part, yes. Burning barked out a laugh. Let me guess, she made the first move. When Izuku didn't look at her or respond, she slapped him on the back with another hearty laugh. You best be careful with her kind then. He stumbled forward at the slap only to be caught by Shoto, who had a small grin on his face at the interaction. The other sidekicks knew of Shoto and let him be while they introduced themselves to Katsuki. The blonde greeted them with a polite tone but in short answers. They took him for a tour after they got changed into their hero suits. The other 2 joined Katsuki's tour even though they knew the agency well enough. An hour later, they were eating a light lunch when Endeavor came into the cafeteria and zeroed in on the trio. He made his way to them and announced, I'll be personally training you 3. Both Shoto and Izuku narrowed their eyes at him. The last time they interned with Endeavor, Izuku barely got any time in hand-to-hand combat with the man, but suddenly he wants to mentor the 3 of them equally. He worked with Shoto alone last time and shoved Izuku to Burnen's capable hands. Izuku spoke first. Why not just do the same thing as last time with me going with Burnen? He had a feeling it had to do with the book Hawks gave to him. Maybe a hidden message. Endeavor stared at Izuku for a long moment before saying, It's better to prepare you all for the worst. Katsuki furrowed his brows. What would the worst entail? The other 2 boys nodded at his question and looked at the flaming man. You don't need to worry about that at the moment. Meet me in the gym. With that, he turned and left the trio looking at each other. I need to reread that book, Izuku muttered as he got up. The other 2 followed soon after. The gym was mostly the same as the last time Izuku went to it. Some exercise machines, weights, and a large area for light sparring. He wonders if the large gym where Izuku and Endeavor sparred was fixed already or not. He had to think it took a while to fix since the support pillars held up the roof of the building and something so vital may have needed delicate work. He was brought out of his musings as Endeavor walked up to them. We'll start with you. He looked at Izuku. What do you want to achieve while being here? Izuku hummed for a moment before saying, More energy is always good and you release lots of waste thermal energy. I want to master or come close to mastering flying. What method are you using to fly? Endeavor asked. Gravity absorption. You can absorb gravity? Endeavor asked with mild surprise. Izuku nodded and showed by absorbing the gravity around him as he began to float. Any energy I come in contact with. The reason why he took so long to absorb gravity from Uraraka was because he had too many energies he was trying to adapt into his fighting style, and he was somewhat worried about the consequences of taking the gravity of an area, especially a commercial area with many buildings. He didn't want to accidentally collapse a building because the gravity shifted. Endeavor was quiet for a moment as he watched the area around Izuku began to float as if they were in space. What about strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force? Have you absorbed them? Can you? He thought about the tremendous power 9F that alone. Izuku held up his hand and made a so-so motion. I should be able to if I got a good showing of the energy. But I don't think it's a great idea for multiple reasons. First and foremost, I can't manipulate the energies I absorb. They come in and out, that's it. And one small mistake with those energies would cause a massive chain reaction that I might not be able to contain. Finally, even if I wanted to gain it, it would slow me down to try and learn such an incredibly complex energy alongside gravity. Endeavor nodded along as he listened. All the while his sidekicks and the other two watched on as Izuku rapid-fired words and the number one hero understood everything he said. Good, that's something we'll begin to work on. Maybe having hawks help you with flight isn't a terrible idea. He moved on to Katsuki. What do you wish to achieve while here? Katsuki looked at his hands and said, I want more control over my explosion. I can avoid collateral damage easily enough, but I want more to come from them. He finished and looked up at the number one hero. Endeavor nodded. Good, Shoto. He turned to his son. More fire, he said simply with a shrug. My specialty. Endeavor snorted. Endeavor gave the three interns a task or goal of capturing a villain before he did. He explained how heroes are required to know their surroundings at all times and be ready to move at a moment's notice. He gave them the challenge of capturing a villain before he did, and Izuku did it within the hour of their patrol. Sure, Endeavor had the advantage of experience and the hero network in his ear, but Izuku just had that raw power to speed ahead of the number one hero and absorb the stamina of a villain trying to run away on a motorcycle. Endeavor gave him a nod at the successful task but was a bit bitter at having his goal completed so quickly. It was hard to compete with Izuku in speed when he could just absorb the gravity around him, speed into a wall without injuries or damage to the wall, and then use that absorbed kinetic energy to blast in the correct direction. They move on with the patrol and continue to learn from Endeavor. He explains about using their quirk's full power without causing collateral damage all around. The week passes with the same process of Endeavor giving them real-world experience and training them back at the agency if they require it. Izuku leapt on the chance to continue his hand-to-hand combat with Endeavor since he had lapsed in that since the first internship with him. Endeavor gave a small hum of annoyance as the four walked down the street. His ever-present heat was closer to his skin ever since Flux joined his agency once again. He turned his head just enough to look over his shoulder at the small green-haired boy whose eyes never stopped moving more than a second. Must you always take my heat away? Izuku's eyes flickered to the large man leading their patrol and then continued scanning the area. He shrugged in answer. It's free energy, I'm just recycling. Save the planet and all that. His eyes crinkled the slightest about. Shoto a bit behind him snorted at Izuku's answer, but his face barely shifted from his neutral expression. Katsuki expelled a small huff from his nose to signal his amusement at Endeavor's plight. Aren't you always absorbing thermal energy? Shoto asked. I'm always absorbing energy in general. Thermal now, light later, sound and kinetic around my feet, and electricity from the static in the air. It's best to get thermal when I'm high in the air since taking all the thermal energy up there won't cause any damage and I can take as much as I can reach. Izuku looked up into the cloudy sky and imagined what would happen if he absorbed all the thermal energy in a cloud. Endeavor listened to Flux speak as he also continued to scan the area. How can you discern which energy is which? Thermal and kinetic are not very different, are they not? Molecules vibrate at different speeds. He asked while not keeping his eyes off the crowds. They are very similar, but my quirk separates them into their own cores. I tried to use one for another but it doesn't work. I can't manipulate the energies, just take them in and release them. Cores? Katsuki asked. Like a bucket, Shoto murmured. Izuku eyed both of his classmates for entirely different reasons. He wanted to laugh at the analogy of his quirk being a bucket but grudgingly answered Katsuki. I can feel the energies collect inside me into cores. Each one feels different. Thermal wants to be used and ready to spread. Nothing like gravity which wants to compress evermore. That's nothing on quirk energy which is unique on its own. He showed an example by holding a bead of the explosive quirk energy he got from the first internship with Endeavor. Each is very different as far as I've seen. My biggest drawback is that I can't control the energies. As Shoto said, I'm a bucket. He finished with a grin under his mask. Endeavor huffs in amusement at the analogy. How goes your control, all of you? He asked the trio. Izuku already knew Katsuki's control was very good and all he truly needed was fine-tuning. While he did dislike his classmate for what he did to him for a decade and getting away with it, he always noted his improvement in techniques. Habits die hard with Izuku and his note-taking. Shoto on the other hand was passable with his ice, but his fire control was lacking comparably. This made sense since he'd only been using his fire for a few months and he was still getting used to using the atrophy part of his quirk. Izuku had been helping him by letting Shoto let loose while he absorbed the thermal energy without worry of collateral damage, but that was mostly stretching the muscle that was his fire. Endeavor tasked the two with working on that and learning when and where to use more power while on patrol. He gave the same task to Izuku in working to learn when to use more power. As the week passed, the trio learned more and more with the hands-on experience of being out on the field. Burnin greets the trio after their patrol. After some teasing prods from her, she asked about the task Endeavor gave them. Only Flux has managed that, Shoto answered. What, already? She looked at Izuku and grinned at him while throwing an arm around his shoulders. You sure work fast, she said with more than one insinuation in her words. Izuku playfully shoved Burnin off of him as she laughed at his pink ears. Endeavor came back to the trio and looked at them. Get cleaned up and change, we're having dinner at my home. Later that day, Izuku walked with the others to the large traditional home of the Todorokis. While he didn't care too much about traditional homes, Shoto's home looked very nice and well taken care of. They were greeted at the door by Shoto's sister, Fuyumi. Natsuo, the eldest brother, joined them not too long after being seated at the dining room. From what Izuku could tell, Natsuo had heavy resentment aimed at their father. It was obvious to see as he sent glares to the number one hero when he wasn't looking and kept quiet around him. Early in the meal, Izuku complimented Fuyumi on the food to have at least some conversation, but when she pushed some of the thanks to Natsuo, things got more tense. Natsuo bitterly mentioned the food being overseasoned and Endeavor might not serve the meal to Shoto. That poke showed the two not of the Todoroki home how bad the water was as they side-eyed each other. While Izuku practically hated Katsuki for what he did to him, he at least had some tact with having guests for dinner and not shoving their dirty laundry onto the dining table. From what Izuku could glance at the blonde, he could agree with Izuku's unspoken thoughts on the matter. As Enji tries to apologize to Natsuo for something Izuku nor Katsuki understood, the elder brother abruptly ends his dinner and thanks Fuyumi for the food. She tries to call him back, but with one last shot at his father for not being able to sit at the same table as him, he left. They finished dinner with the tension lowered and quiet small talk. When everyone finished eating, Enji took a plate of food and left them to clean up. As Izuku and Katsuki washed dishes side by side, they began to overhear the conversation between the two remaining siblings about their father, only to say he was still conflicted about him. Izuku couldn't help but listen to their conversation, and as Katsuki turned his head, so did he. The two finished the dishes and joined the Todorokis in cleaning the table. What do you think, Midoriya? Shoto finally asked him. Izuku was a bit startled at being asked and looked between the two siblings. I should be the last person to ask about family and grudges. I'm just becoming adjusted to a somewhat normal family with Toru and the others. He motioned to a confused-looking Katsuki about grudges. What do you mean about family? Katsuki asked. You mean your deadbeat dad? The green-haired boy paused and stared at Katsuki for a long moment as he tried to read his mind. You don't know. He said it more as a statement than a question. Inko stopped being a mother a long time ago. He turned back to cleaning as he spoke. I don't know what Mitsuki knows, but Inko hasn't spoken to me in years and I haven't seen her in months. She paid for the apartment for the next 3 years and left a note that said goodbye. He knew Inko and Mitsuki had been best of friends before Izuku and Katsuki were born, and even after getting diagnosed as quirkless, Mitsuki had always been nice to him when they saw each other. What? Katsuki asked, shocked at what he had heard. I don't know if it was the shame of having a quirkless child and suddenly him developing a powerful quirk and knowing whatever relationship we had was gone, or something else, but whatever it was drove her to leave me completely. Katsuki was quiet for a long moment before saying, Mom hasn't heard of her in months. She left before the first internships ended, which would be a few months ago. With that, the room was quiet until Shoto broke it. It seems you're the only one who has a normal family, Bakugo. Katsuki could only snort in response. The trio was preparing to leave and Fuyumi thanked Izuku for being a friend to Shoto. He could only give her some platitudes in that sense since they were friendly acquaintances at most, but he didn't say it. Enji soon came out and got ready to take the trio to the school dorms. With one final thanks to Fuyumi for the meal, the four of them load into the car waiting for them. The three were cramped together in the back while Enji took the passenger seat with a chauffeur driving. "What the blazes?" the chauffeur exclaimed as he swerved the car to avoid running over a villain holding Natsuo hostage. Endeavor wasted no time in busting out of the vehicle with his flames burning hot as he confronted the villain holding Natsuo. Endeavor moves to stop the villain from hurting his son but falters when he sees Natsuo in the crossfire. By then, Izuku and the other two joined in the fight to save the oldest Todoroki sibling. Shoto took the lead by blasting flames at the road lines the villain was controlling while Katsuki propelled himself towards Natsuo and separated him from the villain. Seeing his hostage escape, the villain began to toss cars into the air to force Endeavor to use lethal force on the villain like he wanted. Izuku took care of the cars and the victims inside the cars as he absorbed the gravity and kinetic energy from each vehicle before quickly setting them down on the road. His flight was still a work in progress but helped immensely in the task. Shoto landed a fire fist on the villain's head and subdued him as Endeavor checked on his son. Izuku let that drama play out as he checked on the drives of the cars he floated. He was glad to see them all safe and sound. Only one threw up upon opening their car door due to the nausea of being thrown and then losing the gravity holding them to the earth. Izuku helped them by patting their backs. It didn't take long before the police showed up and took the villain away. Izuku looked from a distance as Endeavor talked to his oldest son. He didn't care to try and listen in, he could guess it had to do with their whole family problems. He had no interest in inserting himself into that, but if Shoto needed a friend to help he would do so. With all the excitement over with, Izuku and the other two were finally dropped off at the dorms. Their internship with Endeavor would continue when school started again, 4 days a week. The trio split off to do their own things. Izuku was no different as he looked around for his family. He pursed his lips slightly when he didn't see them in their usual spot in the common room. He shrugged and made his way to his room to drop off his stuff. When he got closer to the room he sensed multiple people inside. With a grin, he opened the door to see almost everyone in his friend group splayed out in his room. Toru and Mina were on his bed while Denki and Honta used a large beanbag chair on the ground. Kyoka was seated against Izuku's bed frame with her phone on her lap. The only two missing were Uraraka and Tsuyu, who were probably on their way back from their internship. "Yo," Mina greeted him first from his bed. She rolled over to look at him right side up and grinned at him. Izuku raised an eyebrow at all of them. "Since when did you guys have keys to my room?" Everyone looked at each other and shrugged unanimously. "Like a week after we moved in," Denki said while picking at his ear. He pulled his finger out and blew on it to get rid of anything he picked up. Kyoka looked at Denki with disgust at the display. "It was Toru's idea." "Well, we needed a hangout spot so I chose this," Toru said sitting crisscross on his bed. Izuku could see the smile on her face and shrugged. "I don't mind, but why my room?" He walked in and dropped off his hero suit in his closet. "Why not your rooms?" "Yours is the biggest," Mina said immediately. Izuku gave her a flat look. "They are all the same size." He only got a grin in response, so he shrugged and joined Toru on his bed. They sat next to each other as they began to chat about their internships. Toru, Mina, and Aoyama lined up an internship with the number 9 hero Yoroi Musha. Toru was especially excited to continue working on her light manipulation and using them as lasers. Kyoka joined Shoji in working with Gang Orca on working on their searching techniques. Izuku smiled and praised their choices. "What about you two?" Izuku asked the two on the bean bag. "Mount Lady," they said in unison. Izuku tilted his head in thought. "Why her?" Denki swished his hair dramatically. "Unlike you all, we don't have the luxury to choose a top ranker. We graciously accepted Minetta's invitation to work with him. Also, Minetta said working with her was pretty chill," Honta added. "That too." Denki nodded. There was a knock on Izuku's door and Uraraka and Sue peeked inside before walking in with smiles. They carried a beanbag chair and a pillow to sit on. The two were greeted happily and they joined in the conversation. Izuku leaned back on his bed and smiled contentedly at the atmosphere they created. Toru leaned against his shoulder and held his hand, happy to see him happy. In hero studies the next day, they were gathered up to show off what they had been working on. Izuku watched on with interest as he mentally took notes on some of his classmates cooked up with their quirks. While nothing revolutionary, it was still very interesting for a quirk nerd to watch. Mina showed off her Acidman super move and compared herself to Kirishima's super move Unbreakable in their similarities. Kirishima was happy to see the mimicry. For his part, Kirishima showed off using his Unbreakable super move on select parts of his body to great effect. Toru for her part shot lasers with the help of Aoyama and redirected them with ease. Even to the degree where she took off her glove to shoot lasers from her fingertips in 5 different directions. She was especially proud of that move, all the while she still hid her ability to become visible to most of everyone. She wanted to keep that one a secret. Of course, her closest friends knew and saw it. Mina was especially happy to take hundreds of pictures together with her. Uraraka's turn came up and she showed an increase to power that most of them didn't expect. While she showed off her regular moves of floating the attacking robots, she moved to show off her newest super move Kinetic Bombardment. She floated up to the floating robots and used them as projectiles as she pushed the absorbed gravity from everything floating. The effect was a robot 20 meters in the air shooting down with the mass of dozens of robots and impacting the standing robot. The two were obliterated under the mass. My goodness, young Uraraka, that was marvelous. All Might praised her with a beaming smile. Uraraka blushed under the praise and took it happily. She shot Izuku a thankful smile as it was with his help she could push the mass into other objects. Finally, came Izuku's turn. He stepped up to the starting area and began by having the gravity in his immediate area be absorbed. Everyone watched as his hair began to float in the smallest debris around him while he lifted off the ground. Then with a crack of kinetic energy, he zoomed forward toward the robot. He coated his arm in intense thermal energy and sliced it in half as he made his way to the next robot. The melted robot solidified as he absorbed the thermal energy behind him. With each turn and movement, a crack of kinetic energy propelled him in the direction he wanted to go. While thermal energy would have been good for long flights, kinetic bursts gave him great mobility in tight conditions. At first, when he was learning how to fly, the sudden stops and turns were disorienting, but he fixed that by simply absorbing his kinetic energy and preventing his internal organs from becoming mush at the intense G-force he put himself under. Izuku moved from one robot to another in bursts of kinetic energy and destroyed them quickly using his whole arsenal of energy at hand. With the final robot ahead of him, he decided to use gravity and compress the energy that wanted to compress everything around it. With a bead of purple energy that felt dense even to those who couldn't sense energies, Izuku did the same he didn't with the thermal beads he created and opened a small part for it to be released. The area aimed in front of him was smashed into the earth violently. The metal making up the robot was made into a flat pancake. The earth cracked under the sudden gravity that compressed it to rock. With a satisfied hum, Izuku turned to his classmates. His family cheered him on like it was a sporting event and he felt warmth fill his chest. Izuku laughed carefree in his dorm room with his family as Denki was reprimanded by Kyoka for shocking her in his show and tell. Denki was trying to show off a shocking aura that he copied from Izuku, but thanks to the laws of the universe, the electricity jumped to Kyoka's jacks, thus her beating of their friend. It's not my fault, Denki yelped as he hid under a bean-bag chair. He waved his arm in the direction of Kyoka. Metal conducts, metal conducts. Kyoka, for her part, was trying to get to Denki with her hair in every direction from the lingering static in the air. I'll conduct this foot up your ass. She kicked the bean-bag chair, and it tore. In slow motion, everyone watched laughing as the bean-bag opened up and released its messy contents onto everyone. White foam beads shot through the air in the wake of Kyoka's kick, and Denki hid under the tarp that contained the mess that spread in Izuku's room. Denki peeked from his hiding place under the remains of the bean bag. Ah, my bag, nice one, Kyo. He looked up from the bag's tear to see all his friends covered in foam beads. He burst into laughter at the scene. Everyone in the room except Denki was covered in the foam that clung to everything. Sue was scraping the stuff off her tongue while Uraraka tried to brush her hair with her hands to get rid of the beads intertwined in it. Not even Izuku was safe from the beads as they clung to his face and hair across the room. "They're in my tape dispensers," Honda cried out as he pulled the tape from his arms in a futile attempt to clear it from foam. "Why are they sticking to my horns?" Mina moaned out as she tried to wipe the foam away, but they kept going around her hand and continued to stick to her. "And my hair. Denki, stop laughing." Tsuyu managed to get the last one off her tongue and then spoke. "I believe it is because of the shocking aura from before. The lingering static had to go somewhere, and we were the best option." Izuku was still grinning as he helped Toru get rid of the foam clinging to her face and hair. "You're not wrong, Tsu. Then absorb the lingering static." Uraraka cried out as she got rid of a handful of foam from her hair only for more to replace them. Toru tried to speak, but some got caught in her mouth, and she tried to spit them out by blowing a raspberry. She inadvertently turned her head to the side, and some spittle covered Izuku's face. "I'm so sorry." She used her hands to wipe Izuku's face but only managed to smear it further. "Sorry, I'm making it worse. Denki, this is all your fault." Izuku laughed through the misfortune of the situation and focused on the static in the air and lingering on his family. He pulled it gently from them, and the foam clinging to them followed just for a bit until it all fell from the air. There were a few cries of static shocks, but he paid no mind to them. Then he pulled the static from Toru, and all the foam dropped from her. From there, they all chipped in to clean the mess in Izuku's room. It took a while, but they managed to gather just about all of the foam and stuff it in the torn bag. With some of Honta's tape, they sealed the bean bag chair, but it wasn't the same as before. "It's droopy," Denki whined. "That's what she said," Tsuyu said immediately in response. "Ha!" Honta barked out a laugh. "Tsu," three girls said reproachfully. "Nice." Mina, the only girl who laughed with Tsu. She gave her a high five for it, and Tsu croaked a smile. The tight-knit group relaxed in the room after that mess. Denki broke the calm silence first. "What do you think they are planning to do with all of 1A supposedly getting together for their work studies?" "You mean what Nezu and Aizawa announced?" "Yeah, that sounds interesting. It can't be for training. Otherwise, we would do it here." Honta furrowed his brows in thought. Izuku nodded with Honta. "I agree, I think it's something bigger. I've been getting a feeling that something has been building up. It's like a seventh sense." He pinched his lower lip as he thought. "You mean sixth," Uraraka pointed out. "Quirk sense is my sixth," Izuku countered. "Well, technically, we all have more than just 5 senses. Like temperature, motion, and time," Tsuyu added. "How can time be a sense?" Denki asked. "You can sense the passage of time, thus time sense." Kyoka made a clock in the air with her ear jacks and pointed 1 second passing on the clock in the air. "Isn't that learned, though? We don't learn to taste or hear. We just do," Mina argued. "Ooh, like if we never learned of time as a concept, we wouldn't sense time," Toru said. "No, that doesn't make sense. Even if a child never knew what a clock or seconds were, they would still know time was passing." Izuku paused. "Like if a child was raised in an underground home where they never knew of the sun and moon cycles, they would still know time was passing." "That's a dark image." Tsu looked at Izuku. "The metaphoric child has all their necessities met and is happy." Izuku rolled his eyes and tried to appease Tsu. "Does the metaphoric child age?" Denki asked. "What kind of stupid question is that?" "Of course, the child would age." Kyoka looked incredulously at him. "Then the child would sense time because they would see their body change," Denki argued. "So if the child had like an age-lock quirk, they wouldn't have a sense of time." Honta tried to reason. "I don't believe that. They would get bored and sense moments pass as they stared at a wall or something. Even if they didn't age, they would sense it passing." Mina shook her head. "Stare at a wall, is that what you did when you were bored?" Kyoka smirked at her friend. "I like to mess with electrical devices when I was bored. Dad had tons of stuff to tinker with," Denki said. "Wait, we got way off topic. What were we talking about?" Uraraka stopped the conversation from going down another tangent. "Right," Izuku snapped his fingers. "We were talking about something going on and everyone gathering for their work studies in a few days." "Right, stop derailing the conversation, Denki." Honta gave a mock glare at his best friend. Denki looked at him with a betrayed look on his face. Just before he opened his mouth to say something, Toru rolled right over it. What do you think is going on? Denki pouted and faced the wall dejectedly. No one cares what Denki thinks, he said, hugging his knees to his chest and making circles on the wall with his finger. Mina patted him on the back in solidarity and just a bit of mockery. Izuku smirked at the scene. I think it's going to be some large operation. His smile faded a bit. At the beginning of my work study, Hawks spoke to Endeavor about something, and I think it caused Endeavor to ramp up our training. He pushed us harder than he did the first time I was with him after the sports festival. Honta hummed in thought. Any ideas? What Hawks said. Izuku nodded. It had to do with him asking if we knew of Destro's book and his ideology. He absorbed his gravity, and to everyone else, it looked like he was flying with precision. In truth, he managed to use a minuscule amount of kinetic energy in bursts to move around. He floated over to his bookshelves and grabbed a book. He returned to his place next to Toru and held up the book. I've heard of that one. Destro's ideology was very radical from what I remember. Suyu croaked softly. Mina squinted at the book cover. Mind filling in the less literate of us. It's pretty simple. Destro wanted a world where quirks, or meta-abilities, were used freely and not shunned on a day-to-day basis like it is today. He believed quirks were part of us and shouldn't be criminalized for using them in public. In today's age, the words have been twisted more and more to the point where it's been labeled as villainous or even as terrorists. The idea of using quirks freely is the same, but with the added caveat that there would be a hierarchy. The strong rule and the weak obey. Izuku lectured and handed over his copy of the book to Uraraka, who wanted to look through it. They were all quiet for a long moment to absorb his words. And you think this has something to do with everyone gathering up for work studies? Denki asked in the quiet. Izuku shrugged. It's all I can think of. There haven't been any clues on the websites I frequent. Endeavor has been quiet on all fronts, and I haven't seen Hawks since. He finished with a sigh. You have his phone number, you can ask. Uraraka flipped the book to its first page to show Hawks' signed name and phone number. The absorber shook his head. I don't trust him. Right, he was raised by the HPSC and probably is bugged to Kingdom Come. Mina pinched her lip in thought. What? When did that happen? Uraraka looked shocked and looked at all of them. Denki snapped his finger and pointed at her. Right, you weren't here for that revelation. I think you and Sue were with Yukio at the time. No, it was when they went shopping together. Uraraka didn't want to go alone, so Sue went with her. You three came back just as they left. Honta pointed at Kyoka, Mina, and Toru. Right, Sue came back with that cute raincoat with the chibi frogs. Toru exclaimed. I like that coat. Sue smiled. Off track, Kyoka reminded them all. So, yeah, Hawks was essentially taken in by the HPSC when he was young and groomed to be their next Lady Nagant or spy or whatever. Mina explained to the two girls out of the loop. Uraraka shook her head in disbelief at what she was hearing. She completely believed Izuku's claims since she had read some of what he researched and how excruciatingly detailed his notes were, so if Izuku said he found proof of what Mina said, then she didn't doubt it. Sue croaked and tilted her head in thought. That makes sense. Hawks has always been off to me. Well, that's because he's a prey bird, and you're. Denki motioned to Sue's whole body. The girl in question narrowed her eyes at Denki's jest. Now, that's gotta be racist, Honta said, pointing at Denki. Mina shook her head. No, he didn't mention race. Frog and bird? Honta countered. Those are species, you idiot. Kyoka made an incredulous face at him. Then it's speciesism. Uraraka pointed out. She turned to Denki and curled her lip at him. Speciest. Izuku shook his head in bemusement at the conversation that kept getting off topic. Toru giggled next to him on his bed and leaned into him. He enjoyed his time in his room with them and their inane conversation. It felt like a breeze of fresh air compared to the stress of having to deal with everything outside his room. He listened to the people he considered family berate Denki for being a bigot against the amphibians. How dare you? I'll have you know I've caught my fair share of frogs in the past. Denki argued in mock outrage. Uraraka gasped and pulled Sue's head to her chest to cover her ears protectively. Are you threatening to catch, Sue? Are you a perv, too? Perv, Kyoka said in disgust. Perv. Hanta crossed his arms and looked away from his best friend. I'm not a perv. Denki shouted. That's like saying water isn't wet, Mina said scornfully and then got confused when some turned to her in incredulity. What? The fuck you mean water isn't wet? Kyoka said to Mina, it's water. Yeah, but water isn't wet, Denki argued on the side of Mina. How can you say some nonsense like water ain't wet? Kyoka scowled at having to say such a thing. Water is a thing that makes other things wet. The property itself can't give itself its own property. Mina crossed her arms and frowned. Uraraka spoke up hesitantly. She's right, Kyo. You're going to side with her. Hanta looked at the gravity user incredulously. Yeah, I'm going to side with logic, Uraraka said as if it was obvious. Fuck you mean logic? You're the idiots who say some ignorant ass shit like water isn't wet. Kyoka was now leaning forward on her seat like she was ready to attack the next person who spoke nonsense. But water isn't wet, Denki argued still. Kyoka gave Denki a venomous and then at the Uraraka who joined Mina in her logic. You fucking heathens. Water is touching itself all the damn time. Therefore, water is wet. Water is not wet, it makes other things wet, Mina argued back. Kyoka shook her head and held it like she was about to burst. That's like saying soap doesn't make itself clean. It doesn't, Denki shouted. It makes other things clean. My god, I can't anymore. Hanta rubbed his forehead. Kyoka pointed at Mina. Your logic is predicated on the fact that this physical object isn't a physical object that touches other objects. Therefore, you stupid, she snarled out. You're essentially saying dirt is dirty because when you put on other than dirt it makes it dirty. The dirt isn't dirty and water isn't wet, Mina said snarling back. You're not wet. Kyoka shot automatically and flushed slightly but focused on the argument. If the thing itself touches itself it has that property. Am I fucking speaking another language? It has to be something else, Mina shouted. Why? Kyoka shouted back. Because it can't make itself itself, Uraraka added in. Lord help us, Sue muttered. Y'all really think water isn't wet? Kyoka sat back and looked at them with arms crossed. Yes. Uraraka, Denki, and Mina said with resolve. Kyoka looked at all three of them. I'm done. I done. She threw her hands up in the air and got up to leave. Where are you going? Mina shouted after her. She didn't get an answer. Get back here and fight me. She also got up and followed after Kyoka. Everyone except for Izuku and Toru ran after Kyoka and Mina. Izuku was covering his face with his hands at the argument that happened in his room and Toru was holding back all the laughter that had been building up. She released it all in a sharp bark of laughter. She laughed so hard that tears streamed down her face and she held her stomach. She got up and pulled Izuku behind her as she followed after them. I can't miss whatever is going to happen, Toru sobbed in laughter. Izuku had given up after the first few words of the argument and couldn't comprehend either side. He didn't know which side to choose so he stayed neutral and hoped they didn't ask for his opinion as they often did to break the tie in arguments. He honestly thought both sides had valid points but he just didn't want to voice them because then the shouting would ramp up like the multiple times before when an argument broke out about nonsensical things like the one just now. Last time it started with Mina saying one movie was better than another and ended with Denki and Hanta rolling on the grass wrestling in a park. It took all of them to separate them and almost started another argument which involved all of them almost wrestling for dominance of the simple opinion. My tummy hurts. Toru giggled a sob as she still dragged Izuku downstairs where they could almost hear their friends still arguing. Izuku shook his head in amusement. How did it go from talking about the work studies to whether water was wet? Between giggles, Toru asked. Is water wet? Izuku didn't answer, knowing the argument would start all over again. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and now we will see you in the next video.